Good evening all and welcome. Tonight's video has been graciously sponsored by Wicked Clothes to help keep YouTube creepy. I can honestly say that this amazing website boasts some of the coolest and most original designs I've ever seen for all things creepy. These are the products that they sent me, and I can honestly say that I love the designs and colors, not to mention that they are super comfortable. And if you would like some threads like these for your very own wardrobe, or perhaps for someone you love, you can check out the link at the very top of the description to find out more. Not to mention that by punching in discount code Mortis, you get a sweet 10% off. Honestly guys, these clothes are really good. I wouldn't be promoting it this much if I didn't really love them myself. And every time you buy, it does help support the channel, so that's pretty sweet too. Like I said, link in the description. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My dad, Don Baker, was a character and a half, larger than life, a big man with enormous presence and a booming laugh. Good-humoured and loquacious, until a switch was flicked somewhere, and suddenly he was angry and dangerous. He married my mother when I was 6 years old, and I came to know both sides of him very well. Those were the only two sides he seemed to have, until he told me this story when I was in my early 20s, and for the first time I saw him uncertain, pensive, and apparently moved by something profound that he didn't understand. Eager to get away from the confines of his small Minnesota hometown and what he called his Norski family, he lied about his age to join the army at 17 in 1938. Almost immediately he was attached to the OSS and sent to China in the aftermath of the invasion of Shanghai by Japan, where he was tasked with gathering intelligence about the growing bloodshed in the area. After Pearl Harbor, he spent the first 2 years of the war as a paratrooper in the South Pacific, until he sustained injuries so severe that he was sent back stateside for hospitalization. After a few months in the hospital, he was deemed well enough to be discharged, but not fit enough to return to action. So, he was attached to the 11th Airborne when it was activated at Camp Mackle in North Carolina, as one of a cadre of flyers and paratroopers who set up the division jump school. While there, he and some of his fellow paratroopers began devising strategies for paratrooper recon, and that brings me to the story he told me. During the Korean War, and long since reassigned to intelligence, he was one of an elite chalk who jumped behind enemy lines to gather information and bring it back to the front line. Because troop movements and skirmishing meant that the front was always changing. Return routes were constantly being redrawn, and sometimes not quickly enough. Many of the paratroopers in the regiment lost their lives because of this inherent danger. On the way back to the front and carrying extremely important information, my dad had made it from his recon position to a spot along the route, about halfway home, when a brutal swarm swept in during the late afternoon, and he had to seek shelter. There was a cave on the route that was behind him. He had to backtrack a short way to it, and once there, he said he sort of had to hunker down and wait for the storm to pass. So he did what any soldier would do in that position. He grabbed some Z's. Sometime later, he was awoken by another member of his team who jumped a day or two before my dad. I can't remember his name, but he was one of my dad's good friends, Buddy. The storm continued to rage outside, but Buddy said he had to risk moving through it to quickly get to my dad, because near to the front, the route Dad was on had been compromised. In the dim glow of the small flashlight, Buddy traced a map in the dirt of another route from the cave to the front that was as safe to follow as any such route is behind enemy lines in a shooting war, and then clapped Dad on the back and said, "You'll get yourself home in one piece." And then, saying he had something else to do, he ducked out of the cave and was gone. Dad said Buddy had probably spent no more than 5 minutes with him in that cave, most likely less, and he added that he really didn't think too much about it at the time. So Dad made it back out to the front without incident, in no more than a few days. Once he dropped off the intelligence, he hit the mess and then his tent, and slept the deep sleep of the truly exhausted. When he awoke the next day and polished himself up, he went to the mess before going to his full debriefing, and found a few more of his buddies having breakfast. They hailed him and told them how glad they were he made it back. He was a little taken by surprise at their enthusiasm, and told them that they weren't going to shake him off anytime soon. They made small talk for a few minutes, and then Dad asked when Buddy had gotten in. The guys exchanged glances, and one of them said, "Didn't make it, Bake." Dad, perplexed, looked from one another and said, "He went out again already?" And then Dad said it was the guys on the team that looked confused. "No, Don," one of them replied. Buddy never made it back from the last jump. At this point, my dad told me he'd begun to get angry. "That can't be possible," he declared to the others. "I came back after him on the new route, and if anything had happened to him, I'd have seen evidence of it, or a fight or confrontation or more activity. But the new route was clean as a whistle, so quit lying to me, goddammit." The other team members visibly stilled, he said, and the atmosphere was strained. After a few more tense moments, the guy who had been answering him leaned towards him and quietly but intently asked him, "What new route, Bake?" Flustered, irritated, and feeling a growing sense of unease, Dad responded, "The new route that Buddy came back to tell me about? The route by the South Pass?" At that, Dad said, the guys were completely stunned. The spokesman for the group, white-faced, shook his head. "That can't be, Don," he answered. 4 days ago, Buddy was killed on his way back from his last recon. He almost made it all the way back. One of our scouts was watching for him and saw the whole thing. The Reds went through his pockets and got the intelligence packet, since that's where the maps are, including the route you were both taking. We thought you were a goner. That's the story. When he finished talking, he fixed me with a grim smile and said, "Buddy was there in that cave with me, as real as you are right now. He was there." It was as if he was answering an argument from me, but of course he was talking to himself. And by the time he got to me, he was dead. Already. By a day at least. If he hadn't have come to stop me from following the same route to give me a new one, I'd be dead too. Sometimes I wonder if I dreamed at all, but damn it, the facts are the facts. I've got back by taking a route I didn't even know of until that night I spent in the cave. A year ago, my apartment complex decided they wanted to renovate my unit, so I had to move out at the end of my lease. I live in Denver, and rent is pretty ridiculous here. So I started worrying about finding something affordable in my neighborhood, which I love. I posted on the Nextdoor app to see if anyone in my neighborhood knew of any affordable rentals in my area. I immediately got a message from someone named Joe, who said that one of the condos in his complex was going to be up for rent soon, and he knew the owner. He offered to get me in touch with them, and I asked if he could send me pictures of the unit, and he asked if he could text me some pictures his neighbor took, because the chat function on the app is really slow. Now I feel stupid for doing this, but I gave him my phone number. I kid you not, I received a phone call from an unknown number within seconds. I normally don't answer calls from unknown numbers, but I was expecting a call from a number that wasn't saved in my phone, so I answered it. I was completely bewildered when the person said, "Hey, it's Joe. How's your day going?" Huh? It took me by surprise and I didn't know what to say. He started to talk on and on about the phone, about how he works nights and how tired he is and how he takes care of his daughter while his girlfriend works during the day, la 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 la. I finally interrupted and said, "So, about the condo?" He pretty much disregarded that and said, "I don't think my girlfriend would appreciate me talking to you, but I don't have to tell her, right?" I said I have to go and immediately hung up. As soon as I did that, he started texting me. It was really bizarre and alarming. I blocked his number and moments later, he found me on Facebook and sent me a friend request. I'm 32 years old, but it was so disturbing to me that I called my parents to tell them about how unnerved it made me. And the worst part was that on Nextdoor, even if your exact address isn't listed, your complex is. I was pretty certain that I didn't have my address visible on my profile, but it checked. And sure enough, the unit number was public, along with my address. Unable to contact me any other way, he started messaging me again and again on Nextdoor, asking if I wanted to go on a walk with him. You can't block or report people on the app, so I deleted it. One night a month or so later, I had a knock at my door around 10 on a weeknight. I looked at my peephole but couldn't get a good look at the person. He had his head slightly down, and either way, I don't answer the door for anyone I'm not expecting, especially not a random guy at 10 at night. Feeling panicked, I called my neighbor across the hall. She's an older woman, and we look out for each other since we both live alone. I asked her if it looked like he was a delivery guy at the wrong door. She opened her door to get a look at the guy, and that spooked him because he literally ran away. I have no idea if this was the next door guy or not, but my gut tells me it was. This was a big wake-up call. I always felt like I practiced good online safety, but I didn't even know my address was visible on Nextdoor. I'll never be casual or lazy about privacy settings like that again. And another story. When I was 18, I was still living at home and started dating a guy who was 20 and lived with roommates. I broke up with him after a few months, when I learned he was getting into coke. He didn't take it all too well. One night a few months later, I was up late studying and I had a test the next day. I shut my light off at around 2 a.m. and as I did so I heard some rustling around outside. Next thing I know, there's a knock on my bedroom window. I was startled and having no idea who was outside, I yelled for my dad. This story is more funny than scary, but my dad then comes running into my room in his underwear with a baseball bat, his hair all messed up. "Who is it?" And the person said, "It's Josh, sir." My dad said, "You aren't dating anymore, go home, Romeo." Then Josh yells, "I just want to talk to you, please come with me." My dad threatened to kick his ass, so he took off. I looked out the window and saw that he sped off in a car with a couple of his friends. I have no idea what his plan was, but he wanted me to go with him. Could have been entirely innocent, but you know, you get that gut feeling when you get it. I live in a tough community with a high crime rate, so I've seen a lot of crazy stuff. I used to take the train into the city for work, and on a regular day I would park my car in the garage at the train station, because this option was much quicker and saved me the wear and tear on my already struggling car. On this day, my car was in the shop getting worked on. So I had my girlfriend drop me off at the train station and asked my father to pick me up in the evening. Now my father is notorious for being late, and despite my telling him I would be there 30 minutes before my train arrived, when I got onto the platform, he was nowhere to be seen. I called him asking him how long he would be there, and he gave me the stereotypical grunt and responded, "Soon." I took a seat on a bench, prepared to wait, when I was approached by a man in a business suit. This is not an uncommon sight because many businessmen and women rode the train here every day. He walked up to me and asked if he could sit for a moment. He had his phone in his hand and kept looking at it, putting it to his ear and periodically checking if he could hear anything on the line. As he sits, he looks at me and says, "I hate these phones. Never work when you need them to." I look back and give him a nod. "Yeah, no." He tells me he just interviewed at his dream job in the city, and the employer told him he would contact him with an answer around this time. He then asked me if I could do him a favor and give his phone a call to make sure he had service and be sure his phone was working properly. Really not thinking anything of it, I agreed and handed him my phone. I'm not afraid of him running away with it because while he is a grown man, I'm not little and I'm confident I would beaten the crap out of this guy. He dials away and without hesitation his phone rings. And a thought pops into my head. That sneaky son of a gun just wanted my number. I should explain why I immediately thought of this. Long story short, I apparently have a certain look that some gay men find attractive. I have been approached on multiple occasions, and I have been asked if by looking at me, they think I am gay. Most say no, but they feel comfortable trying. A compliment at its core, but it happens more times than I care to count. As this guy is in the suit and is pretending to be relieved his phone is working. I'm not angry at him, I thought it was just clever, and shrugged it off as, you got me. He gives me back my phone, and I opened it pretending to look at something important, hoping he would go away. But he didn't. He sat there, watching me. I was getting uncomfortable, and when I am put in a situation, my general response is impulsive, and I want to fight. I'm not homophobic or anything, but he was 3 inches away from me and just looking at me. I could feel my blood pumping, and I keep repeating to myself, keep it up, and you'll see what happens. I have a much bigger bark than bite, but I can confidently say that if you get on my wrong side, I will swing. I look at him and ask if there's anything else he needed, and the creep didn't flinch and just sat there looking at me with a grin on his face. I think he knew I was onto him, and he thought it was funny, but it wasn't. To my amazement, before I told this guy to piss off, my father pulls up and I quickly get to my feet, walk towards the car, and don't acknowledge him nor look back. My father makes a joke when I get to the car, asking if that was my boyfriend because of the way he was looking at me. I laugh and say no. Not a chance I was going to tell my father what the creep was up to. I did this for the creep's sake. My father is a very hard man. Prison, been shot, has found God, and is a wonderful man now, but not the man you want to piss off, especially when it comes to his kids. Later that night I was writing a paper for college when my phone rings. I didn't recognize the number, but it only takes me a few seconds to clock that it's the guy. Hi, I have a missed call by this number. I don't know, you must have the wrong number, man. Are you sure? I feel like I recognize your voice. I think we know each other. Nope, I don't know you and I don't recognize your voice. You have the wrong number. I'm telling you, I think I know. Where do you live? Maybe we're neighbors. Okay, guy, I know who this is, and I don't want to be mean, but I know what you're doing and I'm not interested. Don't call again. Satisfied I did not lose my cool, I went back to my paper and initially forgot all about the call. About 10 minutes later, I get a text message saying something about how he will take care of me. Still on my I'm not gonna lose it mode, I laugh and block the number. Fast forward at least a few months, and I'm with a friend getting a coffee and my phone goes off. It says I has a voicemail and I still don't know how I got it without my phone ringing. When I listen, the voicemail recorded is something like, "Hello Chris, this is Dr. Smith. I want to confirm our appointment tomorrow and let you know we have changed offices. My secretary is on vacation, so if there is no response, just be aware your appointment has been moved to tomorrow and our new office is located at blah, blah, blah." I listened to the voicemail and thought, I have a doctor's appointment tomorrow? However professional the voicemail sounded, it didn't feel right. For one, I had no clue who Dr. Smith was, and I didn't remember making any appointments. I was really trying to figure it out. I was even going as far as to thinking my insurance requires a yearly physical or something. I listened to the voicemail a few times, and on the third or fourth time it hit me. I don't know how, but I recognized the voice. The man from the train. I told my friend and he suggested we drive by the address he listed. When we arrived, we were at these old mill buildings. The area I live in is historic for its mills during the Industrial Revolution. and recently there's been a lot of construction renovating them into offices and apartments, so nothing stood out yet. Parked outside, I needed to see the 5th floor like the voicemail says. We didn't need to go all the way up to the 5th floor to see the building was completely empty. I was surprised we could walk in. No bells rang when looking at the rustic exterior of the building, because even the finished mills had preserved that old look on the outside. However, inside this place is deserted and falling apart. You can tell homeless people stay here because there are a few dirty mattresses and other signs of people having been there. My friends and I looked at each other and both let out a small wail and ran out of there, half scared, half laughing. However, when we got back to the car, I wasn't laughing anymore. I was pissed, and to this day wish I had acted more responsibly. I should have called the police and tried to set him up, but instead I called him back, and when he answered I immediately told him to drop the act. I told him I wasn't going to call the cops, but when or if I ever saw him again, I would end him. I was screaming into the phone telling him all the horrible ways and all the things I would do to him, and I never heard from him again. But I can honestly admit, after my anger went away, I considered the full scope of what he had planned, and it shook me up for a few days. What on earth did he want to do? What could he have done to me? This happened to me when I was in college, and is probably one of the creepiest and weirdest things to ever happen to me. I believe in ghosts. I've had countless experiences in my life that have made it almost impossible for me not to, and this still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I was a freshman in college and was heavily involved in the arts, theatre and music specifically. The fine arts building of my college had quite a bit of history. It was built in 1916 and had previously been one of the largest Masonic temples in the city. This is fairly evident by the Masonic symbols adorning the building and covered the stained glass windows. I'd heard rumors of secret passageways under the building that ran all the way into downtown, but I will say I didn't believe them. A few of my professors had told stories of seeing shadow people or feeling like they were being watched when they knew they were alone, but I thought that they were just messing with us freshmen. I spent most of my time in the costume shop. I should note the costume shop was on the sub-ground floor, technically the basement. It was down 2 flights of stairs from the main entrance that led you to a landing with the costume shop and another door that I just assumed was a utility closet because it was always locked. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was just something off about it to me. On this particular evening, I had finished rehearsal for a play around 6 p.m. and figured I would do a bit of cleaning in the costume shop while I waited for my roommate to meet me so that we could grab some dinner. I was outside the costume shop when I heard a knock on the door. I walked over and looked out the small window to the right side of the door expecting to see my roommate, but there was no one. I opened the door and stepped out looking around. I looked down the hallway to the left of the door to see if my roommate was trying to freak me out. Nothing. I shrugged it off as me being tired and went back into the shop and shut the door behind me. I went about my business for a bit until I heard another knock on the door a few minutes later. I was more hesitant this time. I walked to the door and again I looked out the small window. Still there was no one outside. I tried to open the door, and while the handle turned, the door wouldn't budge. I pulled harder thinking maybe the door was stuck, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like someone was holding the door shut. I looked out the window again and still didn't see anyone. I was now frantically pulling on the handle, feeling the fear rising in my chest. I let go of the handle, only to have it start shaking wildly. Suddenly it stopped. Everything was quiet, with the exception of my own shaky breath. Then from outside the door I heard the sound of a door creaking open. I gathered my strength and tried the door. It opened and I cautiously walked onto the landing. The always locked door was ajar. Hello? Is anyone there? I tried not to sound freaked out, but I was absolutely terrified. I pulled open the door, but was greeted by a pitch-black staircase leading down. It smelt like a tomb sealed for 100 years, musty and ancient. I felt the wall for a light switch but couldn't find one, and I reached into my pocket for my cell phone and turned the screen on. It was bright enough that I could sort of see my way as I made my way down the stairs. The walls were brick and the stairs were made of stone. The closer I got to the bottom, the colder it became, and I was on the second to last step, straining to see what was in front of me. It was a door, a large stone door. I was about to move to the last step when I heard it. Her voice was deep and sounded like it was right in front of me. I had only said one word. Welcome. I couldn't even scream. Instead, I ran up the stairs, tripping at some point and skinning my knee and shin. Once I reached the top, I slammed the door shut and ran out the building. My roommate showed up 5 minutes later to find me standing on the sidewalk shaking. After I told her what happened, she went inside to get my things and locked the costume shop door. When she came out, she looked at me with a worried expression. The door was wide open when I went to get your stuff. Are you sure you closed it? I just nodded my head. I walked home and didn't really talk more about it. I didn't go back into the building until the end of next week. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. When I finally did descend the stairs and felt a chill shoot through my body, I looked at the wall where the door had been, and there was nothing there. It was just a wall. I thought I was losing my mind. I walked to the wall and studied it. My drama teacher happened to be walking by and I stopped him. Wasn't there a door here? He chuckled. Yeah, they walled it up last week. Did it in a hurry too. Not entirely sure why though. I always thought it was a closet or something. I can't say what I encountered that night. Was it the spirit of a Freemason who never left the temple? Was it something more sinister? I honestly don't know. I spent a lot of time in that building over the course of my 2 years at the college, and while I had other odd experiences, they were nothing compared to what I experienced that one awful night. Back in 2004, I worked for a popular Canadian company that sold cell phones/cables/internet and stuff. I worked at a location in the city's local mall for a few years, and over the course of time I got to know and build rapport with the customers that I saw regularly. There was one customer in particular that I served at least once a month. He would buy a prepaid phone with cash every month without fail. As I rang him up the second or third time, I watched him open up his wallet and saw half-inch thick wads of $100 bills. Then it clicked. Monthly burner phones, wads of hundos. He was a dealer, for sure. Now the guy was genuinely a nice dude, always polite, knew me by name, asked how my day was, and I enjoyed seeing him come in. I could tell you countless horror stories of the physical and verbal abuse that we endured at the hands of customers at that location, so it was really great to get to deal with a nice person. And the commission and bump in personal sales was always nice as well. One night, I was at home making dinner. I had the TV on in the background. My program had ended, and the station switched to the 6 o'clock news. As I sat down in front of the TV with my food, the news station opened with a story on a murder that had happened in the city. Suddenly, my favorite customer's mugshot popped up, and I sat there mouth agape, listening to the details of the story. It blew my mind knowing that I had interacted with him every month for probably a solid year. He's actually out of jail now, got an early release and everything, and while I'm sure I'm not really at risk, I'd rather not meet him again. For reference, I work as a barista in a coffee shop inside a larger store. I am one of a handful of male baristas at my shop. I am gay and very open about this. I wear pride shoes, I have a pride flag attached to my name tag, and I have a couple of wristbands with rainbows and phrases like Orlando Strong and a local LGBT+ center. So the other day I was working my shift at the register. A gentleman comes up to me and smiles. I think he noticed the pride flag on my name tag, but he didn't explicitly mention it at first. He says he doesn't know what to order and asks me for my opinion. Now, I'm not particularly a coffee drinker, but I know what drink fits what tastes. So I ask him what he likes and try to give him recommendations. As I'm talking, I can tell he's paying more attention to me than what I'm saying, which I'm completely okay with. He was a shorter but well-built man, had beautiful eyes, a nice beard, and basically pretty nice looking. Eventually he decides on a super sweet iced drink that we have, and I go make it for him. As I'm preparing the drink, one of my co-workers leans over and whispers, "I think the customer just took a picture of you." That was a bit of a red flag, but I thanked her and kind of brushed it off. I gave him his drink, and he smiles. He points to the pride flag and says, "I love that flag. Where can I get one of those?" I laugh and said I got it from a pride event I went to a few years ago. He then says, "And where can I get the person it's attached to?" I immediately felt a rush and started blushing, but trying to act professional, I brush it off. He eventually takes his drink and sits on one of the tables. I continue going on about my day, debating whether I should give in to this guy or not. Every now and then I would glance at his table to see him looking at me. No matter when I looked, it seemed like he was always staring. I started to get that weird feeling of heart eyes with red flags. Then I notice he hasn't taken a single sip of his coffee. Remember, it was a nice drink, so I could see through the clear plastic cup. When I have a break, I go to wipe down some tables. I stop by his table and ask if he didn't like the drink, and if not, I could make him a new one free of charge. He hands me the drink and mentions he's not too sure if it's too sweet for him or not, and asks me to try it. I politely decline, telling him I don't drink coffee. He's shocked and asks me why I'm working here. As we're talking though, his questions start to change. "So, do you lift at all?" "No, not really." "Well, how much do you think you could lift if you had to?" "The job requirement is £50, so I guess at least that much?" "Well, I've learnt it's good to be able to at least lift half of your body weight. How much do you weigh?" Immediately red flags go off. There was something about the combination of the drink and the two questions that made me feel like I was being asked how much of a fight I'd be able to hold, especially if I were drugged. I've been drugged at a party before, and these things are red flags that I have learned to pick up on. So I kindly and quickly end the conversation and go back to cleaning up tables. As the hours go by, he continues to sit there, not drinking his drink. Other employees and a couple of managers ask if everything's okay, and he says he's perfectly happy. Every now and then he takes a phone call, and at one point, I swear I see a guy on his phone at a different part of the store, talking opposite of the guy at the table. Suddenly I start to feel like there are more eyes on me than I realize. I pull one of my managers to the back and tell him I'm getting weirder and weirder feelings about the guy, and the manager says she'll keep an eye on him. Now, I was closing on this shift, and so as we get closer to closing time, I notice he's still there. When the announcement that the store is closing in half an hour is made, he comes up to the counter and asks if he could walk me to my car after I get off. I tell him our closing duties take at least 45 minutes after we close, and he says he'd be happy to wait. I politely decline when he asks when I work next. I tell him I'm off for a few weeks. "Well, then I feel I should walk you to your car, especially if I might not be able to see you for a few weeks." "No, way. I politely decline, and eventually he leaves. I finish my closing duties and head out the employee area. As soon as I get down there, I tell one of my managers about the situation and ask if I can take the side exit from the store. Because at our store, we exit out one of the main doors after we close, but there's a side door that we use to get into the building before we open, and that the managers use to get out after we close. He agrees and tells me he'd walk me to my car to make sure I'm okay if I'm cool with waiting a little, and I am. So I walk out the side door with a few managers and get into my car, and as I'm driving away, I see a large van with extremely tinted windows parked in front of the front door. There's no way to know for sure if my customer was in that van, if it was as ominous as I thought it was, but I know that I was not about to stay and figure it out, and I took a long and winding path home that very night. So to the very hot guy that I sold coffee to, let's not meet again. This happened years ago when I was 17. I was up late watching TV and fell asleep on the couch. I woke up at 4:30 a.m. and dragged myself to bed. Everything seemed normal. The next morning my mum asked where I had gone the night before. I was really confused. The night before, she and my dad had been woken up by the sound of the front door opening and closing. They went downstairs at 2 a.m. and looked outside. My car was not in the driveway. They figured that I'd gone to give a drunk friend a ride home or something, so they weren't worried about it. My dad sat on the couch, the same one I had fallen asleep at and awoken on, and ate a midnight snack, watched some TV and went back to bed at 2:30. We figured out that I had fallen asleep sometime between midnight and 1:30 a.m. because that's when the TV show I remember watching was on. The soles of my feet were extremely dirty, as though I had been walking around outside with no shoes on. So I disappeared with my car for a few hours that night, have absolutely no memory of what happened, and if my mum hadn't have said anything that morning, I wouldn't have even known about it. My father passed away when I was 15, in my freshman year of college. Me and my roommate in the dorms were somewhat close, but really had only known each other for over a month when the incident happened. I hadn't told her much about my childhood, but she knew that my father had passed away. One day she woke me up and asked, "Did your father used to call you Maisie?" I hadn't heard that name since I was 6 or 7. I definitely never told her that he used to call me that, as it was a repressed memory that I had not thought about in a long time. Anyway, as it turned out, she had a dream that my father had come to her and asked her to take care of me, calling me Maisie, my childhood nickname. It was always difficult for me to think that my father never saw me graduate high school or start college, but I guess he did, from wherever he is now. This experience didn't happen to me but my friend. They were working during the day when the command had training. We all go to basketball stadium and listen to people talk. After the training, we go home and it's about 11. Great waste of time. My friend and I had watch and didn't get to go back. They were sitting there and the commanding officer walks in. The pleasantries are exchanged and the commanding officer goes to their office. After a few hours, the commanding officer calls and asks, "I thought you said no one was here." "Yes, sir. You're the only one here. You, myself, and the rover." He then asked the rover to go walk around because he was very clearly hearing talking and walking down the hall. Remember, there's only one way in and one way out of this building, so you know when people come and go. Rover left, walked around the outside, and all fences were locked. We went first floor again, and the common area was empty. The offices were locked, and the second floor and common areas were clear. The commanding office was open with all the others locked. Rover came back and reported what they found, and the friend asked them, if they went into the basement, which was a former morgue, and the kid said no, so away they went. During his look, he found and discovered that he could hear the commanding officer talking through a vent on the second floor. So as he's checking the area, he comes to the place where the lockers and old workout equipment is. He flips the light on in there, flips off the light, and then he hears a rattle. So he turns the lights on again, and now a locker is open. He couldn't remember for sure if it was open before or not, so he turns off the light and hears what sounds like music, and maybe a radio, coming from the locker, and the slamming of a metal door. At that point the kid ran, and they called the commanding officer and told him no one was around. There was also another occasion where I was standing watch, and the ground had a big crash and shake, like a server rack fell over. Someone went to look and there was nothing on the floor. No one has any explanation for that. There are also reports of a headless nurse, but I haven't seen her. A nurse would make sense, since that's where all the deaths from the Pearl Harbor attack happened. I've been noticing some weird stuff happen in our basement recently. It seems to have taken off when our son was born. For context, both my husband's dad and my dad sadly passed away very suddenly at relatively young ages before our son was born. I've had experiences in our house before that makes me sometimes wonder if one or both of them come to visit on occasion. The first two stories I'd like to share with you are as follows. This first one happened a year ago. I was closing everything up to go to bed. I thought I heard a weird sound coming from the basement. It was my son's creepy toy cell phone, just blaring away by itself downstairs. The kind of toy where you physically need to press a button to get it to make a sound. Needless to say, no one was downstairs. When I went down to investigate, it was literally just lying face side up in the middle of the floor, so not like something had fallen on a button or anything. I instantly got the chills like crazy and noped back upstairs pretty quickly. Then about a week or so ago, I was downstairs changing the cat's litter box. Their litter box is in a utility room off the basement hall. To the right is our guest room, and to the left is our son's playroom. When I went downstairs, I noticed that my son's toy robot was sitting in the middle of the guest room. I distinctly remember thinking that it was a weird place for it to be, but shrugging it off, thinking that maybe my son had moved it last time we were down there together. I went and changed the litter, and when I came back out, the robot was sitting in the middle of the playroom again. It had jumped across the entire basement. No one else was downstairs with me, and while the robot can move by itself, it was definitely off, as it's super loud and obnoxious and there's no mistaking it. Then today, as it's Christmas, we got our son a wagon. My husband wrapped it up the other day and blew up a big red balloon that he tied to the wagon, as our son is obsessed with balloons. We left it downstairs in the basement for now, because it's huge and we wanted it to be a surprise. I was running out to the store quickly, and my husband and son were home alone. Suddenly from the basement, he hears a loud pop. He thought it was the cat, just up to no good, but she was upstairs in the kitchen with him. He went downstairs to check it out, and the balloon had popped by itself. It was in the middle of the room with nothing around it that was sharp, and not under any vent or anything. He just said the basement felt super off, and he got pretty creeped out. So, it seems like the creepy incidences are happening in the basement and more frequently. I'd also like to point out that my son has seen my late father-in-law. It happened both in the creepy basement as well as other places around the house. The other day we were eating lunch in the kitchen, and my son was pointing out the various pieces of his art that we've put up on the fridge. He points at one particular piece and says, "I made that one for Grandpa." If you recall, both his grandpas passed before he was born. I asked him which one he meant, and he said the grandpa who visits him at night. About 2 years ago, in the middle of 2017, I was in a really bad place mentally. I was just starting to recover from a crippling addiction, and I was finally beginning to get in a good place and staying sober. For some background, I just had my firstborn child. My boyfriend, our son, and I were living with my dad in a rather large house. This was due in large part to finances. My small family and I couldn't afford to move out on our own yet, even though we knew we needed to get away from my dad's craziness as soon as possible. My boyfriend was in between jobs and he was applying everywhere, but didn't have a lot of luck. My dad, unfortunately, was still very active in his addiction and had a bad habit of allowing streetwalkers he seemingly randomly found to come and live with us. My dad invited a couple who we all call Sarah and Adam to live with us. They were also very active users and would often loudly fight as well as assault each other. We begged for them to stop, but our pleas fell on deaf ears, and I was afraid to call the police because of my young son. I knew they would call CPS, and that they would want to take my son away. I had a bad feeling about living with Sarah and Adam. I begged my father on several occasions to make them leave and move, but he refused because he was having an affair with Sarah and wanted her to leave her boyfriend to be with him. I'm sure this caused many of their fights. My little family tried our best to stay to ourselves. We stayed in our one bedroom, thankfully. We had a full bathroom attached to it, so we didn't share it with anyone else. I would always even go so far as to keep our bedroom door locked when we weren't home. One morning, my boyfriend left early for a job interview at a local restaurant, leaving me and our child alone in our room. I stayed in the room with my baby, not leaving as I had everything I needed to care for him: diapers, wipes, clothes, clean bottle, formula, crib, and everything. Let me briefly explain the setup of our rooms. Our bedroom, as well as the couple's bedroom, were in the back of the house. Our bedroom came out to a long, straight hallway, and at the end of the hallway were the couple's room. I would open the door and look straight out and easily see inside of their room, because where they were staying, the door would often be open. Suddenly I heard a scream from their room in the hallway outside the room. I step out. After making sure the baby was safely in his crib, I checked what was going on. Sarah is hysterical and talking rapidly. I couldn't understand what she was saying, but I could make out there was something wrong with her boyfriend. Looking back on everything, she was probably high. I rushed down the hallway, past hysterical Sarah, and into the bedroom. I don't know why I did this. I should have just taken my baby and left the house, but I guess instinct took over when I knew something was off. I see Adam is laying on the bed motionless, and he's on his back. As soon as I see him, I know something's very wrong. His skin was a deep, unnatural grey color, and he was so still. I rushed over to the bedside and touched his chest. He was so cold. There was no warmth left within him. I placed my fingers under his nose to check if he was breathing. Nothing. Placed my fingers on his wrist to see if I could find a pulse. Nothing. I placed my head on his chest to see if I could hear a heartbeat or detect the rise and fall of a breathing chest, but there was nothing. No breathing, no pulse, and no heartbeat. There was just stillness. His body wasn't even trying anymore to produce even slow, ragged breaths. He was that far gone. He was dead. Looking back, I knew as soon as I saw him that he was gone, but I didn't want to believe it. I'd held out hope that he had merely passed out. The whole time I'm doing this, Sarah is running around me wildly, screaming and crying. I can't remember if I told her to get my dad or if she called him on his own, or if he just heard the commotion and came to check. He was weird and calm the whole time, but I could remember my dad's reaction wrong maybe. To be honest, I don't remember a whole lot of his reaction. From the first time I saw Adam, my mind and memory were a blur. I then rushed back to my baby boy. I was terrified at this point. Maybe I was in the wrong, but in that moment I was more worried about my baby than Adam. I calmly gave my son to my brother, who happened to be visiting us, and was hiding in his room the whole time, somehow unaware. I quickly filled him in. I knew my brother was safe, as he has never done drugs in his life, so I felt comfortable leaving my son with him. I knew my baby would be safe. At this point, after making sure my son was not in any immediate danger, I knew what must be done, even though I didn't want to call for help because I was afraid they'd take my child. Sarah is still running around screaming and crying, and my dad is just silently standing around. Perhaps he was in shock. And I tell Sarah to dial 911. I think I ended up making the call, and a short time later paramedics and police are swarming the house. They tried to resuscitate, but we all knew it was useless. He was gone from the moment I walked in, and had probably been gone for hours at that point. Eventually CPS showed up, and my worst nightmare was realized. They took my baby. My poor boyfriend came back home from his job interview, which he got by the way, blindsided with ambulances and police in our yard. He had no idea what was happening as I didn't have time to call him and fill him in before he got home. They eventually ruled Adam's passing as an accidental overdose. I don't know for sure if it was accidental because Adam had talked before about how unhappy he was and wanted to leave Sarah because he knew she was cheating on him. But he had nowhere else to go. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too far into it. I didn't know him very well, and we certainly weren't friends. The story doesn't have a happy ending. I'm truly sorry that Adam lost his life to the disease of addiction, but I couldn't help but be angry with Adam and myself. I'm angry for what he did, accident or not. I don't know if it's right or wrong with me, but I'm also angry with me. I feel like I could have done things a lot differently if I hadn't been struggling with addiction myself, and they may not have taken my son. I'm still sober, and my boyfriend and I are married now, and we're fighting our state for custody of our son, and we will keep doing so until he is home again. I no longer speak to my father. My boyfriend and I had moved out of my dad's house that day. Thankfully, he had family who let us stay with them until we got on our feet. My dad and Sarah got together almost immediately after Adam's passing, and they're still together. Their relationship is uber toxic and has caused many problems between us. Be careful who you allow into your life and the lives of your children. This story is a few years old, but I remember it pretty well. When I was about 19 years old, I got hired in the fashion department of a local supercenter store. It's a bit like Walmart, but it's exclusive to the Midwest. At the time, I had the sides and back of my hair shaved, and the top of my hair was bleached blonde and twisted into a high bun. This is relevant to the story. I had just finished my computer training 2 days earlier and was on the floor alone stocking some baby clothes. About a box or two into my stocking, an announcement came over the speakers that informed customers our credit card readers were down, but we would be able to take cash at this time. I heard a couple of groans around me, but it seemed like most everyone was content to just go on shopping until it was announced that card readers were back up. I crouched down to grab some more clothes out of a box to shelve them, when a guy walked up to me holding a few items in his hand. "Hey miss, I just have a few items I wanted to buy real quick. Do you know how long the card readers will be down?" Me, still crouched on the floor. "You know, I'm not sure. I don't think this happens very often, but they say that they could still take cash for now." "I only have card on me. Damn, that sucks. I'm sorry about that. Is there anything I can help you with while you need to wait?" "Nah, I guess I'll just hang around. I could stick over here and just bother you." I don't really respond to this comment, and just nodded and got back to folding. The man asked me a few more random questions before he started getting pretty creepy. The guy starts walking a bit closer to me, and he's at least a foot taller than I am. "So, why do you have your hair like that all bleached on top?" "Oh, I just like the way it looks." "No, that's not it. You're doing it for the attention. Nope, I honestly just like the way it looks. Plus, the shaved parts keep me cooler in the summer. What? Your family doesn't give you enough attention? You don't get enough attention from boys? I don't know, I just like my hair like this. Alright, well since you want attention so bad, how about I wait until you get off work, and I can show you the kind of attention I think you deserve. At this point in the conversation, he's practically hovering over me. I think I looked really intimidated because a woman immediately ran over to the two of us when she heard him say that. She quickly pulled me away, telling me that she needed help getting an item down from a high shelf. I'm not sure if the woman was genuinely trying to save me or really did just need help reaching something. I spoke to my manager about the event later in the day, and she informed me that there's nothing she can do for customers like that, and that I'll just have to deal with it. When I got off work that night, I practically ran to my car, praying that the guy wasn't waiting for me. I didn't stick around long enough to see if he was. I'd quit pretty soon after this because I was so shaken. I have no idea what he would have planned for me, but I'm so thankful for that woman. So, a guy who thinks I deserve your creepy attention. Let's not meet. I live in a really old house, at least 400 years old. Last summer my parents were gone for the weekend and my sister was staying at a friend's house, so I was alone. It was a warm evening and I was sitting in the garden browsing Reddit, when suddenly my dog, who was laying beside me, jumps up, and I immediately noticed the hairs on her neck standing up straight. She pointed her nose up in the air, sniffed for a bit, and started barking. She usually never barks unless someone is entering the house, so this put me on edge. Now it's important to know the layout of my house, which actually consists of 2 buildings. The first building is where you enter, then you walk through the garden to the second part, where we live. The first building is still being renovated. You can't enter the second building from anywhere else, so if someone was entering the house, my dog should have been barking towards the first building. But she wasn't. Instead, she was barking towards the second floor of the second building where Myron is. I tried calming the dog down, and she eventually stopped barking. Because there's no way of entering the building without having to walk through the garden past me, I thought she must have heard one of our cats or something, so I didn't bother taking a look. Later that night, when I went to bed, I noticed a side window in my room was open. I never opened this window because you look straight into our neighbor's garden, and he really values his privacy. I closed the window thinking my mum must have left it open or something. That night, I remember having some weird nightmare about a break-in. The next morning when I got up, my sister was home, and she told me that when she came home in the morning, she found me sleepwalking downstairs. That was surprising because that rarely ever happens. She also said I was babbling about some person climbing through a window. Fair to say, I already shat my pants around this time and went back up to my room, and surprise, surprise, the window was open again. Just to clarify, you cannot open the window from the outside. It's simply impossible. I checked around the house to make sure there weren't any signs of a break-in. I didn't find anything, and since that night I've been sleepwalking more frequently. Some days I wake up with clothes on, while I went to bed wearing jogging pants. Other days objects in my room are misplaced, and I've even sent messages in my sleep to a friend of mine. The messages are always cryptic, so I don't really know what to make of them. For example, the first message I sent in my sleep to my friend went as followed: 9, 18, 9, 19, okay. After explaining to my friend that I had been sleepwalking and telling him about the side window, he suggested it may be something paranormal. I once told him about the murder of a woman in the 17th century that took place in my house, and he said it could have something to do with it. Personally, I am skeptical about this. My best theory is that the messages have something to do with whatever I was dreaming about. However, every time I notice I've been sleepwalking, the side window is open. I decided it could just be my sleepwalking self opening the window, so I decided to test this theory by putting a lock on the window and giving my sister the key. This meant that next time I would be sleepwalking, I shouldn't be able to open the window by myself. This was not the case. A week later, I woke up with clothes on. which meant I had been at it again. I checked the window, and to my horror, the lock was gone and the window open. Well, it might have been my sister, right? No. She told me she still had the key and had not given it to me, or anyone for that matter. After this, I boarded up the window and put some extra locks on it as well, just to be sure. After that day, I have not been sleepwalking as often, and the window seems to have stopped opening on its own. But I still notice my dog staring towards my room some evenings. I always hope it's just the cats. I'm not one for believing in ghosts, but there was something in college that could not have been just a coincidence. The dorm room that I stayed at my second semester of sophomore year was the singles dorm room. It was one of the few dorms that you could room by yourself, but they were really tiny. Think like only a twin bed could fit there. Well, one day when I was walking back up to my room, there were these guys outside their own rooms. One of them were pretty shook up, and I overheard him saying that stuff kept falling off his shelves and that things are being slightly rearranged. I didn't think too much of it from then on, at least not until the following year. The year after, I was hanging out with one of my friends when he said he needed to pick up something from his room. So we went into his room and I realized that it was the same room the guy in the previous year stayed at. Before I could say anything, he told me that the room really freaked him out. He said he would be in bed with his girlfriend when all of a sudden he would hear a lady whispering, "Levántate," which means get up in Spanish. He would mostly just hear gibberish from what I remember, and maybe some things would be misplaced. It didn't help when I told him about the previous person there, and there was no way that the two of them knew about each other. Yet, stuff happened in that small room. What makes it creepier is that supposedly the dorm room housed the clergy, as this was a Catholic university, so make of that what you will. But this is the only instance that I can logically explain. This was when I was actually pretty young, 14. I'd annoyed a wannabe bully from my school by making him look like a bit of an idiot in front of his friends. This guy wasn't big or hard, but liked to think he was. I wasn't big or hard either, but I didn't respond well to people attempting to bully me. That night he came after me with a Stanley knife. I was in a McDonald's near a cinema with a few friends. He was off his nut on cheap vodka, cider, and coke. Thankfully, a friend who was friendly with this lad ran into him on his way to McDonald's and was able to warn me. I ducked into the girls' toilets and stayed there until a friend messaged me that it was safe to come out. This was back when texts cost 20p each, so I'm forever thankful for the financial sacrifice. He was hanging around the area looking for me, so I called the taxi and got out of there ASAP. I ended up having a fight with this lad sober in school, and after that things calmed down a bit. He's now in prison for murder after a drug deal that went wrong. The beginning of my junior year in college, I moved into a new house with a really awesome girl named Jess. One day after classes, my friend Meg and I were on the front porch smoking a blunt when this guy walked by. He then went up to my driveway, which was just shared by the house right next door where he lived. He said hi and asked if I knew Jess, as Jess had lived there before I did for a year. So he apparently knew her. I said yeah. She's my roommate, and we made small talk for a bit, and I asked if he wanted a hit of the blunt. He took one and then carried on. After Meg had left, I was still on the porch just finishing up some classwork when that neighbor came out of his house and said hi again. He walked over to my porch and came up the stairs. I didn't think too much of it because he was really chill earlier. He went on to ask me about relationship advice, but all kinds of weird stuff. There's this girl I'm talking to, but she's also sending nudes and hooking up with other guys. Why won't she do that stuff for me? I tried in the nicest way to explain that maybe she's not into him. He then asked me if I would hook up with someone right after meeting them if I found them attractive. I definitely didn't want to hook up, and I didn't find him attractive, but I said that also in the nicest way possible. He kept calling me beautiful and one of the most sexiest girls he's ever met, and the conversation got awkward, so I excused myself inside and said I'd see him later. Later that night, I'd just gotten back from hanging out with a friend. She dropped me off as she drove away, and I was opening my door when my neighbor came swiftly out of his, almost like he was waiting for me. He ran over to my house and posted himself up against my house and asked me if I wanted to hang. I declined, saying I still had classwork I needed to finish before bed. But he was eager. We can do it together, then maybe cuddle. I declined, and again, he eventually gave up and was asking me more suggestive questions about my preferences and if I would hook up with him. I kept deflecting and trying to leave. He eventually asked for a hug, to which I also declined, but he didn't give that one up. He ended up grabbing me and pulling me quite tightly, squeezing me, and that left me feeling sick to my stomach. I quickly pulled away fast and ran back into the house. I locked the door and some time goes by, and I'm cooking in my kitchen when I heard a knock on the front door. None of my friends were coming over, so I'm clueless as to who it could be. I peeked around the corner and saw my neighbor, and my stomach sank a little. Instead of answering the door, I just snuck myself into the bathroom and hid for a second, hoping he'd think I'd fallen asleep. Another 3 knocks come, and then another. Finally, there's silence. Then all of a sudden, he calls out my name through the open window next to my door. Amy, hello? I know you're home. I just have a few questions, Amy. At this point, I was sick. I messaged my friend Corey, who lived in the fraternity house just right down the street from me, to quickly run over here and act like he's coming to hang out. Corey came and met the neighbor at the doorstep. I overheard the neighbor's conversation, which consisted of, "Are you her boyfriend? She told me she was doing homework tonight. Now she's having friends over? Do you think she may like me? Can you tell me more about her?" Corey did an awesome job deflecting, and I opened the door to get him inside as quick as I could. The neighbor asked me to come outside real quick. I did, only because I felt safer with Corey just behind the door. He ended up asking almost the same questions from before and ended the conversation with, "Can I have a hug?" I said I'll see you later and got back into the house. The next day just returned from her boyfriend's, and I told her all about our creepy ass neighbor. She surprisingly knew all about him and his ways. He had pretty much waited outside for her numerous times like he did for me, watched her run up and down the street and try to hang out with her and touch her as well. Jess eventually told her boyfriend about my encounters with our neighbor, and he went over to have a word with him. I'm not sure what he said, but the neighbor never made eye contact with me again. I'm afraid that if I didn't speak up and tell Jess, things would have gotten worse very quickly. I know a lot of people have had far worse situations than me, but this always sends a chill down my spine whenever I think about it. I know it could have gotten a lot worse. In 2005, I hit Okinawa, Japan's shores at the ripe age of 19. I never had an experience or reason to believe in the paranormal at this point. For the next 2 years, all was well, drinking, smoking, and having fun. In 2006, I sustained an eye injury in Fallujah, Iraq, that put me out of commission. Every Marine is a rifleman, and as I could no longer shoot, they made me a barracks manager, as my unit was deployed yet again. I was pumped for this job, as I didn't want to be discharged before my 4 years were up. That, and everyone knew it was a skate job, aka easy as hell. I had the usual problems of broken furniture and such for a while. One day a Marine comes into my office and tells me, "There's a woman in a white dress with long black hair that covers half her face who sits in the upper corner of my room and watches me as I sleep." I think to myself, this man has seen The Ring too many times. I tell him I cannot move his room and to move on with it. At this point in time, I'm manager of Barrack 5696. There came a time when Barrack 5704, diagonal from us, was empty, and we needed renovations. I was in charge of moving everyone to 5704 in order for renovations to begin. After all had been moved and everything was calm, I began an addiction to watching shows like Ghost Adventures and Ghost Hunters, back when they were really fresh and new, and thought to myself, this is all rubbish, and found myself verbally saying such things out loud. And a buddy of mine said, "Hey man, don't you have the keys to 5696? He was right, I did. It was totally empty at night. Piquing my interest, I bought a tape recorder, old school, not a digital recorder, and went into the room the Marine told me about nearly a year ago, set it on top of the mirror above the sink, and locked the door. I left and locked the main and only entrance to Barrack 5696, and went back to Barrack 5704. The next day I let the Japanese painters do their job, as I did every day, and went back up to room 423 to collect the recorder off the top of the mirror. I returned back to my office in 5704 and listened to the tape. I spent nearly 4 hours listening to nothing, dead space. Then it happened. The wall locker in a room next to or adjacent to room 423 began slamming shut, open and shut, open and shut. This went on for a few minutes before other rooms started as well. After a few minutes from the first slamming wall locker, it seemed like the building had come alive. I was disturbed as I was the only individual with a key there. Any enlisted, even above me, would have to either ask me for the key or get one made. Once they did, I cannot fathom them wanting to slam wall lockers closed in the middle of the night, nor able to slam as many as I was hearing at the same time without 20 people at least to help. Yet I heard nothing but slamming wall lockers, no footsteps, no voices, no nothing. Knowing I placed the recorder and told no one, locked the door to the room and the main door to the barracks, creeped me out. No one had access to the barracks, nor knew of my intentions. I was convinced the ghost realm was real, just like Zack. I wanted to find what was out there. I wanted more proof of these spirits. Barracks 5696 was still under renovation, which meant it was completely empty at night, as there were no Japanese working crews then, and I held the only key. I convinced a buddy of mine, who I'll refer to as G, to come with me. We were going to conduct a live ghost hunting session. As exciting as it sounds, it wasn't. We never heard or saw anything. Being our first time, we felt weird talking to empty rooms of nothingness. We felt like nothing was there, but we were wrong. We would pick random rooms throughout the barracks, opening whichever room we felt at the time. As we walked down to the office of 5696, as it still had power and the office was functional, we joked that there was nothing there, and the banging wall locker still haunted my thoughts, and I wanted to know more. So I plugged in my digital recorder into the PC and started the exhausting journey of reviewing our files, one for each room. G was unconvinced as we entered rooms 3 or 4 on the recording. Then it happened. I said the usual, "Good evening, my name's Will," and G asked, "Can you tell us your names?" Clear as day we get a response that said, "Get out." Neither of our voices, and we were within arm's reach of each other. This was the first of many threats I received, attempting to find the truth inside this barracks, a truth that came to manifest my home life, and made me never want to mess with the paranormal again. But I did. The allure was just too strong, and sometime later, the following events happened. I was living off base at the time with a girlfriend in a 10-story building. We were on the 10th floor, and everything seemed fine when we moved in. At least she never mentioned anything at this point. After a few weeks of doing EVPs nightly at 5696, she started to talk about this shadow person. I asked her where she saw it. There wasn't anything about it other than shadow. Was it threatening towards you? All the usual stuff. She said it was always in the walk-in closet, had some color of glowing eyes, orange I think, and just creeped her out in general, but never tried to harm her. After hearing this, I started to freak out, as I was having some issues in 5696 that I never mentioned to her, but seems like I may have brought home, or perhaps it's been here the whole time. During this time frame, I started getting strange things on my EVPs. Not the usual get outs or hellos, but things that seemed far more intelligent and sinister. For example, I would always introduce myself. Hello and good evening, my name is William. I only wish to communicate and mean you no harm. Besides my name, these entities should have known nothing else about me. Yet I was getting responses from them calling me by my childhood nickname. A nickname I hadn't used in years, and the other guys with me damn sure didn't. They once asked who my mother was. Now this may not have been specifically aimed towards me, if it wasn't followed up by a whisper saying my mother's name, which was a different voice from the first. I lost patches of hair on the back of my head that looked like fingerprints in a pattern, suggesting something had grabbed the back of it. Doctor said it was stress and gave me a steroid shot, but the hair refused to grow back for 3 months. 3 months just so happened to be the same time I grew concerned with the EVPs I was getting and threw in the towel. I locked 5696 up one final time and never returned there after dark. The hair that grew back was pitch black, and I had blonde hair, and stayed that way for many years. These days it's slightly lighter, maybe from sun exposure, but it's never been the same color it should be. Finally, I had a dream in a 10-story building right before I quit, and it was some kind of evil red creature laughing and prodding at me while it tortured me. When I woke and realized it was just a dream, I was relieved. Shortly after this dream of mine, which I never told anyone, my girlfriend had a similar dream. We went through a rough patch and I moved out of the apartment, but she left shortly after, stating something was bothering our son in the middle of the night, something unseen. Today she's a minister and swears to me I brought something evil home all those years ago, and that it has been following her. I lived in a very old home. I'm talking built in the 1700s and protected under the US Historical Register, kind of old. And the dude who built it was super rich. It's a big old white house, very The Conjuring-esque. I've lived there most of my childhood, along with my parents and 3 older siblings. I often played alone because my older brothers didn't want to play with their little sister, who's years younger than them. So naturally I spent a lot of time upstairs or in the library of the house. There were certain rooms that just had really good vibes, like nothing but happiness in there. There was also a small B&B type room upstairs, and my mum used it to store her extremely realistic portraits. You felt watched in there, but in contrast, there was the basement. Occasionally, I would visit my dad, down in the basement. He had a small workshop, and I hated the basement. Whenever I would walk down there, it's as if something was ever so slightly pushing me back up the stairs to safety. I felt like someone was always watching me down there, almost waiting for me to get just a little closer. Like I mentioned before, rooms in the house were either great vibes or hell no. One such room was the parlor. It just felt very cold, strict and harsh. Fast forward to years later. My mother is trying desperately to sell the house, as we moved for my dad's job across the state. Everyone who's even rented it was out of the house a few months later. One day while she was showing the house, she brought me along as we're very close, and it's not unusual for me to go with her when she's showing houses. I was chilling in the kitchen when my phone died. I'd forgotten the charger. Anyway, I spot a binder on the table. Now this is my mum's thick binder of all the tenants who lived in the house since the 1700s, and I see a tab labelled deceased, and horror enthusiast me was morbidly curious. Apparently, a small girl had passed away in my room of pneumonia. I think, okay. However, a man had also ended his life via rope in the basement. Well, that explains the vibe, I think. Reading a little further, and there was an awful man who gambled away his life savings, avid racist, drank a lot, and remember how I said the library had great vibes? Apparently a really nice woman used that as her study to teach young girls. She also passed in that house. The parlour, very strict, old school woman, apparently had an aneurysm in that room. A year later, after countless rejects from prospective buyers, my mum decides to have the house cleansed. The woman comes and she was like a priest. She says that, and without knowing about any prior passings, mind you, that there was an evil in the basement actively trying to do us harm. However, she said it was countered by the good spirit of a woman, but she says it was a spirit of our family, someone we were close to. I asked her who it could be, but of course, she didn't know. To make an already long story short, she cleansed the house. Apparently, the evil within the basement was very old and very weak. She also said something quite interesting. She said that it was years since the house had a family, with children running about and bringing it to life in the place. The house loved us and didn't want us to let go of the family that it hadn't had in years. This was a few years back, so I can't really remember what comes after it, only that we eventually sold it. So yeah. That's my strange story about the paranormal. I was around 11 or so, and was just laying in bed thinking about stuff to help me drift off into sleep. I had an issue with sleep, hence why I tried to avoid it. So I just lay there, and out of the blue, loud music started blaring into the room. It was so loud and sounded like a mix of hip-hop and rock. I would love to hear some of that, but I couldn't even tell where it was coming from, and it almost sounded like a fire alarm going off. I lived in an apartment at the time with my family, so I just closed my eyes and hoped for them to rush in, but they didn't. It makes no sense that they didn't hear it, since it's a pretty small apartment. I just laid there frozen in fear with my eyes shut, and after what felt like an eternity I stopped. I still didn't even open my eyes, expecting something to be right in my face. I just lay there, acting like I was asleep until I finally was. I wake up in the morning to talk about it with my parents, and they chalked it up to a bad dream. It is possible, but it was so vivid and real. Too much continuity. I could hardly even remember the music. I remember trying to play it in my own voice to my parents. So to this day, I assume it was an exploding head syndrome attack or something. Some psychological sciencey experience caused by poor sleep. At least, that's what I tell myself. This happened to me in March of 2020, right before the pandemic. I had recently moved to a new apartment complex alone, as I was having relationship issues, but nothing I care to get into. When I first moved into the building, I mostly kept to myself, and the people I met were pretty friendly and neighborly. Previously to settling into my new home, I took a trip back home and accidentally left my building's keys at my aunt's over 4 hours away. She agreed to mail them, and this had me chasing down the mailman daily to catch my package. It was an older gentleman that I also said hello to here and there. Nothing beyond a quick hello or wave. So one day when I was downstairs waiting to meet the postal lady, This gentleman is down there and he says hello to me, with a clear accent, and I say hello back. He starts to make small talk and I oblige, as I've always been good with older people. So this next part is stupid of me, but I guess I was just naive. The old man asks to kiss my hand. Weirded out, I assume it's some kind of cultural thing, and I extend my hand, which was a big mistake. This guy was old enough to be my grandfather, then kisses my forehead and cheek in a matter of seconds. As I push him off, he asks me to come up to his apartment, and I firmly decline. Then rush out the main door as the postal worker was coming up. The creepy old man yells after me that he loves me, and I just felt so dirty. My boyfriend came to stay with me shortly after, as when I reported it to my landlords, they told me next time it happens to tell him I'm not interested and call the cops. Thanks, guys. Thankfully, I haven't seen him again, and I really don't want to. When I was young, I believe around 3 to 5, my mom moved into the city where I live with my dad, so I would usually only visit her on occasions. The house she moved into was a large 2-story 3-bedroom home with a 2-car garage and a nice backyard and a little treehouse for kids. The basement has always been a place my mum never wanted us to see. She never went down there, never even used it for storage. I never went down because she told me not to unless she was going down, which was almost never. I didn't think any more of it, and went along with my life. One summer I'd gone to stay with her for a while, and this was also around the time that everyone usually came over and visited anyway. So I had a few aunties, uncles, cousins, and my little brother. On this particular day, my brother and 2 cousins, who were my age or younger, went downstairs just to see what was there. There's a door at the bottom of the stairs, and I remember when it opened, a cool breeze came through and brushed my face. I turned on the light and walked inside. They were all pretty fantasized by how large and roomy it was. And the literal only thing that sat in that basement was a grand piano, which, later finding out, belonged to the previous owner and was there when my mum moved in. We wandered around for about 5 minutes. I was more drawn in by the piano because I'd always found it captivating as an instrument. Soon my mum found out we went down, but calmly called us up for dinner. We all ran up the stairs, me being the last one out, just making sure everyone was accounted for. We played for probably about only 1 minute before we realized that my brother wasn't with us. We looked for him, called his name, but there was no answer, and we couldn't find him. I went to the stairs and listened, and sure enough heard my brother frantically screaming and crying, wiggling at the door handle. I was confused because I thought he was up, and I didn't lock the door. I was scared, but I knew he must have been scared too, so I rushed down the stairs and quickly pushed the door open, and run back up, only to come face to face with my brother at the top of the stairs. "I'm right here," my brother says, walking out of his playroom. My bones shudder in fear. I look back down the stairs to see no one, and the door was creaked open. I think about it all the time, what it could have possibly been. In the mid-1990s, I was a hospital corpsman in the Navy. My first duty station was Naval Hospital Beaufort in Beaufort, South Carolina. I was assigned to the Branch Medical Clinic, BMC, at Marine Corps Recruitment Depot, Parris Island. I have many stories from my time there, some paranormal and some not. At the time I was assigned to Parris Island, all incoming corpsmen had to do a 2-week night duty, where we would man the phones and radios from 10 o'clock to 6 a.m. During this time, we would also tidy up the trauma room and the emergency treatment room, and make sure all handheld radios were on their charging bases and fully charged, and making sure the trauma bags taken out by corpsmen covering the recruit activities were fully stocked. The first few nights of my rotation were uneventful. About the 4th or 5th night, I came in to find the duty crew a bit spooked. I'd been told on my first day of processing into my new duty station that the main hospital and Paris Island were haunted. Made sense to me. All the buildings were really old. Anyway, that one night I came in and the duty crew told me the radios had been weird the entire evening, but failed to go into any detail. I settled in for the night with some music playing softly in a book. After a bit, I heard one of the radios being keyed, like someone was pressing the talk button to create a noise. Certain that someone was messing with me, I went and checked the handhelds and all were accounted for, and off. Nobody else used our frequency. Throughout the night I would hear the radios being keyed, always in odd patterns. It took several nights of this before I recognized the patterns as Morse code, SOS, but no one was there. A few times the television in the lounge would turn on and off. It would also change channel frequently. You would hear odd noises in unoccupied parts of the clinic. Most of the time these noises came from the area where recruits came in for their immunizations and medical processing. This area used to be the trauma bay until the 1980s. Back in the late 1960s and 70s, no one sure when, but it was Vietnam era, it said that there was a recruit who was on fire watch one night and started experiencing shortness of breath and chest pains. He didn't want to wake anyone, so he waited for his relief to take over. Then he walked from 2nd Battalion to the BMC, about 1.5 miles. He was unable to open the door and pounded on it, but no one heard him, and he passed away from cardiac arrest and wasn't found until next morning. That door is no longer used for emergencies and is supposed to stay locked. No matter how many times we would lock the door, it would not remain locked. Sometimes we would hear the door opening and closing in the middle of the night, but no one was ever there when we investigated. My last night on night duty, I had just finished cleaning up the treatment room. I was setting up chairs in the corridor for patients to sit on when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked up and saw a tall, skinny recruit standing at attention towards the end of the corridor near recruit processing and the door that would not lock. I called him out, asked what he wanted. He didn't appear. I called out again and there was no answer. I began to walk towards him and he vanished. That was by far not the last time I was ever on duty at night at the clinic, but luckily it was the last time I ever saw an apparition at the clinic. My oldest sister used to sleepwalk and talk a lot, and it used to scare the ever-loving crap out of me. Being about 8 at the time when we shared a room, I would be staring at the ceiling late at night, hearing her mumble and talk incoherently. She didn't sound like my sister and I hated it. She even once got up at 3 in the morning and began dressing for school, completely asleep. I had to gently wake her while trying not to freak her out. Of course, now I look back, it's hilarious. One night as I dreamt, I felt a heavy weight bearing down on my chest. I opened my eyes to see my sister, with a glazed look in her eyes, holding a pillow on my chest and putting all of her weight on it. As I come to terms with what's happening, I freak out and tell her to get off me. This was after possibly a year of creepy sleep stuff that 8-year-old me was having. Her eyes popped open. She looked around and said, "What's happening?" She then proceeded to walk sleepily back to her bed and cuddled the pillow she nearly murdered her sister with. Yeah, we don't talk much now. I work at GameStop. It's a great job and I'm surrounded by everything that I enjoy. Games, anime, etc. I've been told that I'm attractive. I'm not saying this to be conceited, it just makes the story make more sense. And I've been told from my manager that it's why he hired me, because a large percentage of our customers are male. I mainly work on the registers. This job consists of greeting people when they walk in and of course working the register. It was getting close to closing time and I was the only one up front at this time. I was getting started with my closing duties when I heard the buzzer go off when the doors opened. Without looking, I welcomed the customer. "Hi, welcome to GameStop. Let me know if there's anything I can help you find." Normally I get a hello or they respond with a question, but it was silent. I look up from behind the counter and see the man that just entered the door looking at me. But once my eyes met his, he looked away and started looking at the games on the shelves. I shrug it off. It's normal for male customers not to greet me because they think because I'm female I don't have valid knowledge about games, and I continue with my closing duties. I'm bent behind the counter when I feel someone standing on the other side. It's the man. He puts the games on the counter and says nothing. I grab his games from the drawers and then I proceed with the normal questions we ask. "Did you find everything alright? Do you have a phone number with us? Do you want us to protect this game for you?" My questions get met with silence, and all he does is stare. I turn my attention back to the register, and while finishing up the transaction, I can feel his eyes digging into the side of my head. I print out his receipt and put his games in a bag, and he takes it and turns around to leave. Again, I shrug this interaction off, as it's not out of the ordinary for me. It's almost time for me to pull down the gates and lock up, when I get a call. I groan because I think it's a customer trying to wiggle their way in before we close, and I pick up the phone to hear heavy breathing. Hi, thanks for calling GameStop. This is Amber. How may I help you?" "I was just inside buying some games." "Oh, was something wrong with the purchase?" "No, I'm just calling to let you know that I received your signals." At this point I'm very confused because I treated him like any other customer. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." "I'm calling you to let you know I picked up on your signals." I know I should have hung up at this point, but I was curious to what he was referring to. "You are very beautiful, and your signals were received. When do you get off? I'll be waiting." At this point in the conversation I hung up, rushed forward, closed the gates and locked up the store. I went into the back and told my manager about the phone call, and he said after I finished closing up, she would take me home, because my apartment complex is very close, so I walked. As I was quickly replacing the trash bags, I saw a car pull up in front of the store and park. No one gets out. Fortunately, my manager parked out back and we left via the back door. I never saw the guy again, but every time I walk home I think about that one particular customer. I am 20 and no longer live at home, but we moved into my parents' house when I was 8 and my sister was 4. I had always had spirit encounters as long as I can remember and dreamed where people visited me. My sister now, 16, is going through the same thing. But when we were little, my parents made our basement into a playroom/office type area. The only problem is that neither me or my sister would go down there, to the point where my sister would scream and cry if she were forced to go. My mum's old dog passed in the old house, and in life hated thunderstorms, so a common occurrence at my old house was to hear her nails tapping along the hardwood floor, pacing during storms. Her residual spirit didn't follow us, but for a while I thought it did, because I would hear tapping. It took me about a year to realize it wasn't her, because it would happen even when it wasn't thundering, and moreover, it sounded different, almost like scratching. Around the time I was 10, my sister 6, I finally discovered that Elizabeth is a very stern, the world is one way type of woman. She did not like the basement, and she made it known by causing a cold spot on all our stairs leading down every time I or my sister tried to go down there. At this point, my sister would only go down there if my parents took her down. I would go only to pick things up for my mum or dad, but would get this feeling of being watched and hated every time I made it down there. Elizabeth was of course the ghost. When things started moving, at first it was toys that we had never touched down there. We were too scared to play with them. Then it was things that went missing. My dad's work files from the desktop, keys, and even once my cat's food bowl. See, the way our basement was laid out was that only the bottom half of it was sub-level, and the other half had a door into the garage. And it also had our laundry room, where my orange tabby cat had his food, water, bed, and litter box. But we used to have to carry my cat down there and force him to eat or use the litter box. But he'd be fine as long as the laundry room door was closed. One day me and my mom are watching a movie, when I hear my cat freak out in the basement, then a slam. We both bolted to the basement to find my cat fluffed, hissing, and more importantly locked in the laundry room. None of us had even put him in. When I was 12, I was allowed to start having sleepovers. Well, girls consistently go home early, complaining that they didn't feel well. A few times later, they told me they were freaked out by our basement and couldn't sleep because they felt as if someone was watching them. This was around the same time I finally stopped seeing the Two-Hat Man. Almost every kid in my town is haunted by these same two spirits, apparently. And so I was really confused since I couldn't see him. And why was everyone else still complaining about it like he was still there? But when I was 14, something truly frightening happened. My friend and I were in the basement for a sleepover. It was around 3 a.m. and we were both woken up by what we thought was each other. But then we heard the scratching noises, and we couldn't be more confused. Then, honestly, I have no idea how to explain this next part without sounding even crazier than I already do. Something growled under the couch that we were both on, and not like a cat growl, something loud and vicious and evil. We both looked at each other confused and still scared. When I heard Elizabeth scream, "Go!" I grabbed my friend's hand and bolted up the stairs, explaining to my dad what happened. He let us sleep in my parents' room that night. Thanks, ghost. The next day my great-uncle came over. He's a priest, and blessed the entire house. He said he felt the evil thing in our basement leave. He said it was a demon. When my dad asked why it had been there so long without causing any harm, it was actually kind of funny. My parents had inherited a large, beautiful iron cross that my mum had decided to use as decor in the basement. That, on top of the fact that Elizabeth was there to protect me and my sister, meant it never really got the chance to get its hands on us. My great-uncle recommended putting salt in the corners of every room and saying the rosary as we did it. So once a month we did, and while I still have plenty of experiences in that house, none of them were ever evil again. I'm a South Asian female. This happened when I was in my first year of engineering and was almost 10 years ago. Harmless ragging was a thing back then, and as juniors we were asked for no more than to sing a song or imitate a professor. You know, silly stuff. This one guy, a senior named Adish, happened to come across me in one of these silly ragging sessions and apparently found me interesting and cute. I wore shorts a lot, and he even nicknamed me Sassy Pants, and yelled it out whenever he sees me on campus, irrespective of the crowd of people. He tries getting my number through my classmates and hostel mates, and tries to get me to add him on Facebook. When I don't respond, he threatens my friends to force me into talking to him. I do because I don't want them to get beaten up. I obviously didn't want to cause any problems as I was barely 18 and was away from home for the first time. Adish keeps asking me to go out with him, and I keep refusing. One day I'm at the local ATM to take out some money, and it's a small room with just the machine. I didn't know he was there because I was facing the inner area, and he walks in and stands against the only door of the enclosure. I turn around in the vestibule, panicking, thinking I'm about to be robbed by this guy. when he says, "Come on, I'll drop you on campus on my bike." I refuse and he won't let me out. Fortunately, the guard comes and he obviously has to move. I share this with my friends and they're horrified as well. Now the stalking begins. He messages me on Facebook and says what colour dress I wore, and if something noteworthy happens in the lectures that I attended each day. He challenges me to find out how he is able to know so much. He knows my routines so well, he comes down to my hospital and openly asks me to go out with him in front of all of the maintenance staff. I again avoid responding and get mortified. I threaten him that if he interferes in my life, I'll report the behavior to the dean and other authorities. The creep responds, "It's not like I asked you to sleep with me. I have tons of girls who want to be with me, and I ignore them all for you. I know girls play hard to get, but this is arrogant of you." Well, this goes on for 6 months, near the end of the semester. Thankfully, he's in his final year and will graduate and has to get the hell out of there. And that was the only thought keeping me from having a nervous breakdown. On the day of the Foundation Day celebration on campus, it's evening and he calls me on my phone and asks me to meet him one last time. As usual, I ignore this. He calls up a friend of mine and threatens to throw acid on her, which she tearfully calls me and informs me, leaving me visibly shaken. I tell my friends about this, and we're all still good friends even 10 years later, and they, my loyal soldiers, say okay. If he wants to talk to you one last time, let him, but in front of us. I tell him that, and he comes over to campus where the event is going on. My entire group of friends step out, 7 of us, including me, which has 4 guys, and met him nearby. He asks in mock politeness if he can talk to me alone, and even before I respond with no, my gang are like, either you talk to her in front of us or not at all. He conceded and spoke some rubbish romantic talk, which doesn't matter, and finally leaves. He graduated a few days later, and I'm glad that I never saw or heard from him again. But what kind of messed up creature threatens to throw acid on someone? He was a real piece of work, and I hope to never meet you again. In late 2006, 2 strange events occurred on my first deployment to Iraq. A little background. The base we were on was near Iskandaraya. It was a 4 smokestack power plant on the Euphrates River. It was like the military just walled off a 1x1 kilometer box around it. At the time, I think there were 800 personnel on the base, not including the Iraqis that ran the plant. There were paved streets, stop signs, nighttime street lights. The enemy rarely tried attacking it with mortars or rockets because they didn't want to screw up their power. It supposedly powered 1/3 of Iraq. When we first landed there on the LZ, we thought they dropped us in a town and not an FOB. It was different than what you expect an FOB to look like. Everyone stayed in what we called cans, tin 2-person units. In the northeast corner of their FOB, however, my small specialized unit stayed in 2 houses. In the southwest corner, away from most of the personnel. One of the houses was pretty generic, but right next to it, the other was a mini mansion, which we referred to as the Taj Mahal. It had about 8 rooms, most with their own bathroom including shower. There was a kitchen and a dining room too. It was decorated with marble floors, wood accents, gold chandeliers, and 1 nice carpet. The upper floor rooms had balconies that overlooked the Euphrates River, but the windows were sandbagged off due to the line of sight across it. It was pretty awesome thinking back. The rumor was that Saddam used it when he visited the plant, but my guess was that it was just an exaggeration and it was used by visiting VIPs. So here's where it gets weird. Myself and another guy called John shared an upstairs bedroom. When the lights were off, the room was completely dark. One morning after we were both waking up, he asked if I saw who came into the room last night and used our bathroom. whoever it was. It didn't wake me, and I'm a pretty light sleeper. John said someone wearing PT shorts, a tan undershirt, flip-flops and red lenses came in and used our restroom and left without saying a word. The clothing description is what most guys slept in. The next morning we asked around and no one fessed up, which was weird because we're a pretty tight-knit group and there was an abundance of working bathrooms in the Taj. So a few weeks or maybe months later, it's pretty much the same scenario. John and I are asleep in the middle of the night in a pitch-black room, and I'm awoken by a medic who's calling my name, who's clear as day in a pitch-black room. He says, "Hey man, they need you downstairs," with a huge grin on his face. I'm awake and my eyes are open and I respond with, "What's going on?" Mid-sentence, my medic just completely disappears, and I shout, which wakes up John, who I tell what happened. Nothing like that has ever happened since. Same deployment. One night, there was a legit UFO sighting on multiple bases reported, and I actually saw it. The only way I could describe it, it was like a cone-shaped light in the sky, pointy side down. It was like a high-powered flashlight was hovering above it, 500 feet pointing straight up. You couldn't make anything out besides the off-white cone of the light. No clue whatever came of that. When I was young, my dad purchased some land on the side of a small mountain in eastern Washington near the Canadian border. He had this land for years, and during this time, he would use shipping containers as an underground home. Before he had a mostly livable setting for this underground home, I had a dream that has shaken me to this day. In my dream, I was in my bunk in the container. We had a cloth to separate the area for the door and the bunks. I stood up and noticed the light was on. I moved the clothes to the side and saw a man that had old farmer clothing from the early 1900s and was short and stocky. He reminded me of Danny DeVito in his younger years, but as a farmer. But there was something very noticeably different about him. His skin was inky black, with occasional grey blotches appearing and fading out in random places. He had no eyes or even a face, but the weird part was that I wasn't scared. He spoke something in an odd language, and then the door to the container opened in an inky black abyss that undulated like the farmer man. I had a feeling that a choice had to be made, go through the door or go back to sleep. I began walking through the door but stopped with my foot on the edge of the threshold and started turning. Then before I fell, I woke. I was relieved it was a dream. Not long after, my dad went to the truck and noticed the clock was on the correct time. But all the clocks in the container, including one that was supposed to be correct due to following the planet's magnetic field, was 2 hours behind. They all were. I was 14 when this happened. I'm 31 now and remember it like it was yesterday. What the hell happened that day? I may never know. Between the ages of 9 and 15, I lived in a very small northern town in a Canadian province. This town was the first European settlement in the province from way back in the late 1700s. The last remaining original building while I was living there was an old Hudson's Bay Company trading post. Most people living in the town were either full-blooded Cree or Métis, with a few white families throughout, one being mine, and there were a few First Nation reservations around the area. Basically, super old town in Canadian terms with lots of First Nation history. And here are my handful of experiences. The first house we lived in always had a heavy energy to it. That's what I remember most clearly about it. That, and my room was always cold, no matter how warm it was in the rest of the house. For a while, nothing seemed off, other than that. I do remember our dog, Shadow, a rescue mutt who looked like a black wolf dog, would always sleep in my room there. That was a bit out of the ordinary too. Since when we got her, she's always favoured sleeping in my older sister's room, until we moved into that house. A few nights we would see her growling at nothing. This would of course be in my room or at the top of the stairs. When I started going to school and attempting to make friends, the question would of course come up about where I lived. As I said, the town was small, very small. In the town and surrounding area, there may be max 500 people, and the junior/high school had a whopping 75 kids. So I mentioned the house and kids would be like, "Oh, that place is haunted." Someone had mentioned that their aunt used to live there and would keep a mirror at the top of the stairs of the basement to keep away the bad spirits. So yeah, that's what a 10-year-old likes to hear. Nothing horribly scary happened to me that I can recall, other than this one night. I woke up around 3 a.m. I didn't notice it at first, but there was a very slow rhythmic tapping that sounded like it was coming from the wall. I checked the window to see if I had left it open, and the blinds were moving gently against it, but there was nothing. It was sealed tight, but the tapping continued. I checked my stereo. This was long enough ago that I still had one of those extendable metal antennae to see if it was vibrating for some reason, and it was hitting the wall. But it wasn't, and the tapping persisted. Now completely perplexed, I decided to get up and have a better look around my room, and as soon as I sat up, the tapping increased in speed and aggression. Startled, I laid back down, and it slowed down again. I tried once more and the same thing happened, with it tapping more furiously and intensely. So I laid back down and did what every kid does. I threw the blankets over my head and somehow I managed to fall back asleep. When I woke up again, it was 7 a.m. and the sun was up, and my room was quiet. That was the only night I remember Shadow not staying in my room at night. Eventually we moved to a better house in a different area. The air was lighter and the rooms brighter, but there was still something off. I began to see shadows out of the corner of my eyes, on the periphery of my vision. Dark heads poking around corners or peeking through the banisters on the stairs. I know now about shadow people and I didn't then. I can say though that it was never outright aggressive, just enough of a feeling of otherness that it unsettled me and my friend. Every once in a while I would hear my dad come home from work. The garage door would open, I'd hear my dad close the truck, and there was a heavy metal door from the garage in the house. I would hear that open, close, and then my dad put his briefcase on his desk. I'd turn around from my cartoons to greet him, but he wasn't there. Then almost always an hour later I'd hear it again, and this time it actually was my dad. It wasn't until one day when my mum, my sister and I were having a conversation over lunch that one of us mentions seeing shadows in the house. And from there, the stories we've all kept to ourselves start coming out. My sister, whose room was right next to my dad's office at the entrance, told us she also heard the imitation of our dad come home. She also mentioned that one time she went to the washroom and it was occupied. She waited outside the door, heard the toilet flush, heard the sink turn on and off, the fan and the light turn off, the door unlock and open, but no one walked out. Another time she was in a room speaking with her boyfriend, telling him about George, because that's what we decided to name the shadow person. He laughed it off, and like any silly boy with something to prove, started mocking him. He said a wind blew through the office outside her room and blew papers everywhere towards the guy. She also had weird experiences in our first house. Being the edgy teen that she was, she insisted on having a room in the basement. She said that she would see red eyes at night sometimes and hear her name called. Another time, she went to her friend's place. The friend's place happens to be the old original Hudson's Bay Company building. And being the genius spooky kids they were, they thought they'd play with a Ouija board. This ended up with another massive gust of wind, her friend speaking in tongues, and footsteps on the fire escape. The third account that people often report is the devil's footprints. Bipedal cloven footprints left in the snow. Enough people up there are avid hunters and trackers that I trust them to know the difference between a natural animal print and something else. There's also an old hospital. Some nights a mist would form in the outline of it, but the hospital is now gone, and the mist swirls around its vanished foundations. Many of the First Nation kids I went to school with would talk about seeing a Wendigo in the woods. At the time I had no idea what a Wendigo was, just that the kids were very freaked out by it. That's what I remember from about 20 years ago in rural northern Canada. I was a junior at college, coming back to my dorm room after a night of fun with friends. Now I had a drink or two over the course of the night, but I definitely wasn't drunk. I should also mention that my college was about 200 years old and connected to a Benedictine monastery that will come into play later. So anyway, I walk into my room and turn around and lock the door. My roommate had moved out to live with her boyfriend, which hadn't bothered me until maybe a few weeks before that night. I liked having more space and turned her bed into a lounge area, obviously. But I had started hearing what I can only describe as breathing noises. The dormitory was old though, so I chalked it up to the radiator and continued on with college life. That night I heard the breathing and ignored it, washed my face, ate some cookies and then curled up in my bed and went to sleep. This is where things got weird. I woke up at some point and my room was dark, of course, but I could see an even darker outline of a tall, skinny man with a wide-brimmed hat just standing in my doorway looking at me. As soon as I looked at it, I felt really, really sick, but also really tired, and fell back asleep and passed out. The next morning, I assumed it was a really freaky dream and said nothing to anyone. A few weeks pass, the breathing is louder, and I'm having super violent, super religious dreams on a nightly basis. I'm not mentioning any of this to my friends because I don't want them to think I'm a nutcase. Well, one day we're all BSing about our college one night when one of our friends who was getting ready to enter the monastery told us that our campus was haunted. Right, we said, like every other college campus. He said, no, one of his priest friends at the monastery said that there are a few things hanging around the campus, but there's only one that you need to worry about. A tall, skinny man wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Well, I about lost it and asked my friend what I should do if I saw it. He told me to go to confession, put prayer cards around my window and doors, and pray some very specific prayers. So I did. Immediately. That night the breathing noises and violent dreams stopped, and thank God I never saw that thing again. When I was around 5 years old, I was laying in my bed. I had a nightlight and the room wasn't dark, and a tall, dark, slim figure poked its head in my door. I looked at it and said, "Mom?" Nothing happened. "Dad?" Nothing happened. So I just stuck my head under the covers and went to bed. The next morning I asked my parents if they'd come into my room, and they both said no. As an adult on 3 separate times, I've had something push me down on either side of me while I was laying in bed. I keep my eyes closed, and it will get really bright, as if you shine a flashlight at your face with your eyes closed. It always creeps me out, but I never see anything. The last time it happened about a month ago, it felt like something was trying to pull me out of myself, but I thought, no, I don't want to, and it stopped. Maybe about a week ago I saw this bright light outside my window. It didn't look like a star or helicopter spotlight. It was almost as if someone had a foam flashlight and was shining it in the window. I wanted to look at it, but kept getting this eerie feeling that if I did, I would get snatched. After a while I went away, but my room was extremely bright. Of course my boyfriend was knocked out and didn't even notice at all. I've always had a very peaceful life, raised by respectable parents who lived in a decent town and pretty much sheltered by the evils of this world. When I was in my early 20s, I had a few friends. They weren't bad kids by any means, but didn't use their heads and chose the best people to choose to be around. One night my friends Zach and James were out cruising around. Now Zach and James did have an issue with drugs. I was never so easily persuaded by peer pressure, nor pursued a life to impress anyone. However, I had no problem standing my ground with anyone. Sometimes it's best if you walk away from any situation that you feel could go wrong, which is something I should have done that night. Luckily, I'm still here to share this story. I was out cruising with Zach and James, and they make poor choices in life. They decide they want to score some dope from a friend called Carly. She was an okay person, just another soul who became an addict. I was okay with going, although it was never my kind of scene. However, when I arrived, there are some people that I'd never met before. Have you ever met people and you instantly just get bad vibes from them? Well, this is one of those moments where you assess a situation and know you should just say, "Hey, I'm gonna go see another friend," and walk away. I had that feeling that these guys aren't good people, and I should have listened to my gut instinct, but didn't. We walked into Carly's house, and I just got the sense that these people aren't the kind I want to associate with. Instead, I sit there and wait for Zach and James to do their thing and get the hell out. Well, it's not going as fast as I would like. That's when a guy called Ricky starts asking me a bunch of questions like where I'm from and who do I know. I'm sitting there playing it cool, listing off some people I know. There was one person who was known well, an old baseball team member and schoolmate, who was a very troubled soul who got into plenty of trouble. "Do you know Bishop?" I said. That's when the Q&A session stopped and became a heated ordeal. I guess Bishop and Ricky had some beef with one another, and things escalated quickly. Ricky began making threats towards me, saying he was going to call up one of his friends which knew the friend as well. The other one was well known for violence, and he was from the same small town as I was. Me being an idiot, I stood up and continued this senseless argument, with him threatening me, and that no one would ever find me when he was done with me. I foolishly spout back the same ignorance to him, despite it not being my nature. At the time, I just thought if I stood my ground, I would get respect. Carly's mum came in the room and told everyone they need to calm down and asked me to leave, to which I happily obliged. Fast forward 10 years in the future. I moved from my home state to Illinois and came back to visit family and friends. I was talking to my friend Jared, who was one of the closest friends I had for about half my life. He brought up the fact that Carly had passed away from an overdose, and he said, "Did you hear about her boyfriend Ricky?" I said no and asked what happened. Apparently, he had taken a girl from a local university, a ballerina, and the specifics of what he did to her are too horrific to mention, but let's just say her remains were found in the woods. He was caught, convicted, and is now serving life in prison. Sadly, Carly and Ricky had a child together. Carly, of course, passed away, and the child's father is serving life in prison. My friend Zach also passed of an overdose as well a few years back. The world of drugs is a very dark place, filled with people who are just as dark as the world they live in. Take my advice. If you find yourself in a situation you feel is uncomfortable and possibly dangerous, just turn around and leave. I got lucky, as things could have been much more deadlier. I was a Navy sailor who went out to sea many times for weeks at a time. One of my jobs was being a lookout to spot boats, planes, and things in the water or air pretty much and report it back to the ship. My lookout rotation could have me standing watch during the day or nights, sometimes both. And it was during the night where I was pretty afraid, especially if you were at the back of the ship alone. For anyone who hasn't been out in the middle of the ocean in the middle of the night, you should realize you see many more lights in the sky than you ever would in the city. And on Navy ships, they feel like they have very little lights on at night, so standing around 1 a.m. feels very alien, and during the nights, without a bright moon to help with your vision, you may as well be on a different planet. There was this one time I saw a bright green color moving in the water slowly, and it didn't know what it was. My mind told me it maybe was a USO or something. Eventually, I was told it was just plankton, but it sure was freaky for someone who wasn't aware of the phenomena. Another time, me and another guy were standing watch together, and I decided to just look up during 2 a.m. and see what I could see. And when I looked at the midnight sky, I could see meteors streaking across it. A few times there were bright lights moving out the way. Maybe satellites, who knows. But I stared at it for a good 20 minutes, and at about 15 minutes, slow moving lights in different areas of the sky, perhaps very far apart, started moving. Either way, those were the few times I saw for myself how vast space really is, and that there was just so many things unknown to humans that we have yet to discover. When I was 11, I lived in a pretty bad neighborhood. To paint a picture, there were very common street races, gunfights, and fight clubs around. All this in mind, I hated being home alone. My parents, knowing this, allowed me to have a friend over whenever they would be out late to keep me calm, as I have some heavy anxiety. I had a neighbor who was a boy around my age, perhaps just a little bit older. When I went outside to play with or walk my dog, he would talk to me, so he wasn't a complete stranger. One day my parents were going out on a date night and would be out until at least 2 to 3 a.m. So they said I could have a sleepover with my best friend. All was going well and we were playing some video games in the living room when suddenly around midnight my neighbor started crawling through my dining room window. As someone who has heavy anxiety, I was prepared for such a situation and had a weapon with me and instructed my best friend to get my dog since he is fiercely protective. I wasn't scared of this kid. I've seen him fight and figured I could take him if I needed to with all my precautions in place. The conversation went as such. What the hell? Why are you crawling through my window? What do you want? Whoa, relax. I just wanted to hang with you and your friend. I could hear you laughing from my house and wanted some in. You're not supposed to be here. My mum and dad will get mad. I just want to hang out for a little bit, get some food, play some games, come on. Then he refused to leave, and I don't remember most of what he said. I didn't feel threatened and decided to let him stay since he wouldn't take no for an answer. He stole a good amount of my food too. One thing I noticed is that he was avoiding the windows but didn't make it obvious, so I tried not to think about it since I was scared. He went home after about an hour and my friend and I didn't think much of it. The next morning I was in the front yard doing who knows what, when I see the kid getting his ass beat and screamed at by his older sister. I laughed and asked what he did, and she told me something that made my blood freeze. She told me that he was hiding from the cops, as he beat some kids so bad he sent them to the hospital and damaged some property at school, where the fight took place. I avoided that house and those kids as much as possible, and we moved away shortly after. This happened about a year ago. Since then, I've never had a haircut. My mum and I were in a mall salon for a haircut. She stated my name to the receptionist, and since the salon was not that full by the time, I immediately got called. My hair was shampooed by a skinny guy who was a little too chit-chatty. He was the junior hairstylist. While he was washing my hair, my phone beeped several times, since I had messages from my friends. He started asking me questions. Do you have a lot of friends? Is that your boyfriend texting you? I thought it was weird. However, it wasn't over yet. He started asking me where I lived, where I went to school. Did I have someone waiting for me outside? Of course, I didn't give him accurate information. He was starting to give me the creeps. Now, a junior hairstylist usually assists a senior hairstylist, right? I found relief when the junior came because the skinny guy stopped asking me weird questions. But when the senior left for a while, he slipped a pen and paper under the table and told me to write my name on Facebook so we could be friends and talk any time. Bro. Since I remembered the receptionist listing down my first name, I was afraid he would ask that person. I didn't pick up the pen at first and he kept on eyeing me in the mirror. Luckily, the senior came back and continued to cut my hair. When the senior was done with my hair, the junior was assigned to blow dry. I was forced to write my name on the paper, and since I was aware of what he's doing, I wrote my incomplete name and changed the spelling so there was no way he could find me. Nonetheless, my hands were shaking, but I doubt he noticed it. Just when I thought he was done with his scheme, he started to touch my shoulder with his hard, erect member while blow-drying my hair. I wanted to scream and tell him to get the hell off me, but I really couldn't. I was frozen in fear. Take note, this was a well-known salon with a good reputation. I'm certain that every employee was trained well. I wonder how he got there and what he did to deserve his place. I still regret the fact that I did nothing to make him stop. I know I should have done something. I know I was a terrible person, but since then I swore to myself I'd do the right thing if something like that ever happens again. I wish I would have got his ass fired. When I was 7, I woke up in the middle of the night with an earache and decided to tell my mum and stepdad and walked out my room. Someone was sitting on a chair in the living room about 3 feet away from my door. The person looked strange. The face was just kind of distorted, but it was dark and I couldn't see well. "Mum?" I asked. The person shook their head, and I started getting scared. "Mike?" The person shook their head again. I decided the best course of action was to go back to bed, so I wouldn't have to walk past this person. I climbed in bed and closed my eyes for a second before opening them and seeing the person standing in my doorway, smiling and nodding furiously. I screamed at the top of my lungs and closed my eyes. My stepdad came running out of his room in his underwear with a baseball bat, which was a scary sight in itself. There was nothing there but clothes my mum had folded and put on the chair that was strewn about the living room. For the longest time, I told myself it was my cat sitting on the clothes. I'm currently serving in the army, and I'm stationed in Hawaii, in the Schofield barracks. I had a long day and decided I'd have something to drink since it was early enough in the day that I could get to sleep and wake up sober for morning formation. Laying in bed, watching Reddit stories on YouTube when I fell asleep much earlier than I usually do by accident, and thus not setting my alarm for the next day. Any person in the military can tell you that missing morning formation is a big no-no. So there's a lamp in my closet that was sitting on a shelf above my head level, and has been there since I got my room. I suddenly awake to the lamp falling off the shelf and hitting the floor, but not scaring me. Like I said, I was just awakened by it. Thinking to myself that it's weird, but also remembering that I haven't set my alarm for the next day, I open my clock app and start setting them when out of the corner of my eye I see a wispy white figure walk past me. I quickly dart my eye to see it, and poof, nothing there. Again, none of this scared me, as something like this usually would, and I found a comfort in believing it was a guardian angel walking to me to have me set my alarm, so I didn't get into trouble for missing formation. What did freak me out, however, is after I closed the door and went back to sleep, about 2 minutes into me laying back down, I heard a loud meow coming from the closet. I jumped immediately, turned on my lights and swung my closet door open to find nothing. Barracks do not allow pets or animals, and for those thinking maybe the lamp just fell on its own, there's no discernible reason it would have, as it's pretty far back on the shelf and hadn't been moved or touched since I got there about a month ago, and had never fallen before. I was living with my mother's ex-husband because he was my father figure when I was younger. I didn't know I was home alone until after everything, and we were in an old house. I was upstairs in my bed just resting and wanting to take a nap, but it was one of those days where you want to sleep, but you have so much energy at the same time you're just thinking. I was laying there and I heard the basement door open. Someone walking down the hallway again. Even though it's an old house, I could hear every movement, and I was in silence with my bedroom door open. They walked down the hall and to the stairs that led to all the bedrooms, and I thought it was my stepdad at the time just going to his room to get ready. I heard every step. It was slow, pronounced, and steady. Then I heard the shuffling of feet on the carpet, and I was still facing the wall, and the feet walked into my room and went right behind me. For some reason I didn't feel like talking, so I pretended I was asleep because I thought it was my stepdad. So I closed my eyes and pretended not to be conscious. After 30 seconds I heard the feet turn around and walk back down the stairs, down the hall, and close the basement door. Immediately after that the garage door opened and I heard my stepdad, his girlfriend, and her kids walk into the house. I was home alone the entire time. This happened about a month ago, when I was working at a store called Box Lunch. It was on the upper level of this mall. I'm a 16-year-old dude and had worked there for about 6 months before this event occurred. I was working the late shift, which was from 6 to 9 p.m. that day. The store closed at 9 and that's when I would lock up and leave. I was working with one other person that night called May. She was my age, maybe a month older, and she was a super fun person to hang out with and work with. She was chill and not super talkative, which was great because I'm not talkative either. We went to the same high school and kind of knew each other and got along easily. I would even pick her up sometimes to go to work if we were working the same shift. Side note, not related to the story, but I think May liked me, and I kinda hoped so because I really liked her. Anyway, we were both behind the counter just talking and laughing. May I remind you that there was barely anyone in the small mall because it was late, so that left me and May alone in the store for a while. As we were talking, this skinny man wearing a train conductor hat walks into the store. He was an older man, maybe in his 50s or older. He was wearing this dirty green jacket and badly ripped jeans. This dude looked like he was homeless, but I didn't want to assume anything. May greeted him with a smile, and he didn't pay any attention to her, just kept walking through the store. We kind of looked at each other, sort of with a, yikes, what's up with this guy though? As he was looking through the store, I kept an eye on him to make sure he wouldn't try to steal anything. I didn't see him do this, but he kept talking to himself and glancing back at May and I. I was getting weird vibes from him. After about 15 minutes, he walked up to the counter, placed a Terminator Funko Pop on the counter, and I asked him the usual cashier questions, which he didn't answer in any way. He wasn't even looking at me. He kept glancing at May, who was messing around on the computer. I don't think she noticed. I rang up his total, and he pulled out a crumpled $10 bill and handed it to me. He took the Funko Pop and left, no receipt and no change. He walked out and that was the end of that. May and I had just talked about the guy and what happened. Some chills, some laughs, and before we knew it our shift was over and we began to lock up. We walked out to my car in the parking lot. We talked and it felt like any other regular day, where I'd drive her home and see her the next time we work. But this wasn't the same. When we got pretty close to my car, May noticed there was something on the hood. I didn't see it at first because it looked small from where we were standing. When we came up to the car, I realized what it was, and my heart sank, as did hers. It was the Terminator figurine the weird man bought from the store. I picked it up and looked at it. May was freaking out and looked all around the parking lot to try and find the man. It didn't make any sense to me how this guy could know which car was mine. I looked up and joined May in looking around the parking lot. Then I noticed that same man standing under one of the street lamps in front of me. It was like something out of a movie, because once he saw me, he began to walk towards us. I told May to get into the car and she didn't object. We got into the car and I left the parking lot as fast as my car could go. We were both freaked out and were trying to figure out what just happened to drive to her house. Over the next few weeks or so, we talked about it at school, at work, and to each other. We never told anyone else because they probably wouldn't have believed us. I am a 21-year-old female and moved to a new city last year for work. I had a lot of trouble finding a decently affordable place to live, so at the time, as I now have an affordable house to rent, I found a small apartment on the edge of a bad part of town, but it was affordable and newly renovated. Initially when I moved in I had no issues, but soon discovered that the couple upstairs were a little rough around the edges, always screaming at each other, throwing things, slamming doors, and it made for a lot of sleepless nights. One thing I found out was the guy upstairs was a dealer, and this is important when we get to the main part of the story. One night I had got home from work pretty late, so by the time I finally cleaned up dinner and started getting ready to sleep it was around 10:30. I had just laid down in bed when I heard a knock on the door, and honestly, I shouldn't have even considered opening it because, well, three things. It was 10:30 at night, I wasn't expecting anyone, and to get into the building and up to the apartment doors you have to have a key or have an apartment buzz you in. Still, I made my way to the front of the door and cracked it open and found a man, probably in his late 20s, wearing a black hoodie and jeans, rocking back and forth in my doorway. As soon as he saw the door open, he leaned right in, trying to push his way into my apartment, repeating the same sentence over and over. "I need to talk, Brad, let me in." Obviously, I didn't want this guy in my apartment, so I'm just trying to shove the door closed while telling the man that no Brad lives here, it's just me. This went on for what felt like forever, but probably lasted no more than a few minutes. Suddenly, he stood up straight and just walked away and said nothing. I was a little shaken, so I went into my room and just sat there for a while, wondering why the hell I would open the door in the first place to a stranger. I ended up hearing a commotion from the lobby area and went down and saw how this guy got into the building. The glass front door was completely smashed, which explains how he got in. Going back to the neighbor upstairs, and this was someone who regularly bought from him, who was coming into the building trying to find him for some reason, that I can only imagine was pretty sinister by the way he was trying to get into my apartment. Hopefully, we'll never meet again. When I was 16 back in 2006, my best friend and I used to go to her brother's house to use his wife's tanning bed. One day me and my best friend were alone in the house. She had a copy of the key, and she said I could tan first while she checked her Yahoo Messenger, so I went to the basement where the tanning bed was. It was in a room all by itself. It was actually a hidden room. The door was in a closet, so if the clothes were in front, you wouldn't know it was there. I got all lotioned up and had the tanning bed heating up. After it went off from the initial warm-up, I put in my headphones and just played a random song from my iPod. This was a 20-minute tanning bed, but after 5 minutes it shuts itself off. I get out, restart it and get back in, and after a few minutes I can hear footsteps over to my music. I turn my head sideways and look through the crack of the tanning bed, but notice nothing. Even though I said my friend's name, I got no response, so I just closed my eyes until the bed shut itself off again. I got out and was getting dressed when I noticed my glasses on the floor. They were twisted and out of shape, like one side was in the normal position and the other was now facing the ceiling. Immediately I ran up the stairs. My best friend hadn't left the computer. She was always on Yahoo Chat, and I told her what happened and we both were freaking out. She decided not to tan that day. Bad thing is, this wasn't the first time something had happened in the basement. We used to spend the night there all the time, but stuff would just randomly happen, and so we started to avoid it. Somewhere in 2007, I was stationed in Camp Pendleton, specifically Camp Horner. I was acting as officer of the day. The command post is a long building about half the length of a football field with a long hallway going all the way down. Our office is dead center next to the stairs. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard footsteps upstairs. Knowing I was the only person awake in the building, as my assistant was sleeping in the bed provided in the duty hut, I went to investigate. I checked all the rooms and found no one or nothing, and came back down to my post, and my assistant duty was awake and rushing to put his boots on. I asked him what was wrong, and he exclaimed he heard a faint scream from down the hall. We both checked the entire perimeter and found nothing. Once we went back to the post, we heard what sounded like a door toggle furiously upstairs for 3 seconds, and the rest of the night was quiet. I reported the events to my superiors, who laughed it off and said it was dog. Found out these buildings were pre-World War II, and supposedly a Navy corpsman failed to save a life of a Marine and ended his own life upstairs. Never confirmed the story to be true, but the events sure convinced me. Have you ever had a dream that you woke up from a dream but you're still dreaming? I have. I kept waking up in a strange house, and the only thing that made me realize I was dreaming was a vacuum cleaner in the corner of the room. I must have woken up only to realize I was still dreaming at least 5 or 6 times. It was weird in itself, and after a few days I just sort of put it out my mind. Then about 3 months later, I was visiting my cousin in his house. I'd never been there before, and he had just moved in, and I had an odd sense of deja vu. I couldn't really put my finger on why, so I forgot about it soon after it happened. The next morning I could have sworn that I was having the same dream in a dream. It was the same room as the original dream, and there was a vacuum cleaner in the corner, so obviously it was a recurring dream. Nope, I was really awake, and I was really in that room that I had dreamed about a few months earlier. I know it isn't as creepy as a lot of the stories on here, but it sure as hell creeped me out. The thing is that I've had 2 other dreams that have either been warnings or premonitions. They're just so ludicrous. The basement where my uni assigned the clubs to set base. I clearly remember that this was on my first day of going to college. A friend from high school wanted to audition for the choir, and he was a little embarrassed, so he dragged me along. Turned out, non-auditionees weren't allowed to enter the club room, so I waited outside looking like a dork. The room next to the choir belonged to the dance club. There was an upperclassman blasting music while he sat by the door like he was some bouncer. I took the liberty of glancing inside the cramped room. They didn't have much, some chairs, student things, and a clothes hanger, and a shabby-looking closet. Like, they just hanged a pole between 2 walls and started hanging their costumes there, nothing really eye-catching except for a small pale hand that suddenly protruded from between the clothes. Jesus, did it make my eyes bulge and my heart pound so fast. I looked at the upperclassman and he looked at me, probably noticing how startled I looked, and he shook his head and told me, "Don't mind it," and blasted his music louder. The hand also slipped back into the closet. Like I said, it's just a pole they had hanging clothes on. It wasn't really a closet, so there's no way I would have missed it. And the fact that there were no feet standing below or a person behind those clothes, just a pale child's hand. I yeeted out of that place and left the doofus who was still doing auditions behind. I have a few stories to share. One is from my current command, MBK Bangor in Washington. There's a story that a long time ago this little Indian girl was found by this guy, and he elected to end her life after subjecting her to horrific travesties. The man who owned this land before it was made into a base was the one who did it. The creepy thing is that her burial site is on the land, deep within the woods. When I was taking classes to drive an armored vehicle, we had to do night driving, and the off-road course goes very close to the site. The sergeant who was operating my second set of eyes looks to the right side of the vehicle and told me to stop. It's pitch black, and I can't see anything without my night vision goggles, and think the sergeant is just trying to mess with me. The two other vehicles stop behind us and get out, asking what's up. The sergeant says he saw something in the woods when we were driving. It was out of my line of sight, so I didn't see it, but the sergeant was very spooked. The vehicle behind us started talking about the girl and a Marine that ended his life 10 years ago. I'm not a believer in any of this, so I just say let's finish, because it's already 2 a.m. And then we go through the course a second time. At this point I'm a passenger, and the sergeant is in the back while a corpsman drives. I saw some stuff the entire time and said nothing. I asked around a bit, and that's when I found out it was a burial site. The thing I saw was about 4 feet tall and looked like a small person, in tall, random clearings in the woods. Definitely not shadows, and I don't think it was the NVD malfunctioning, but it definitely looked real. I've had other people go on this course and experience similar things also. I work the night shift, so I get off at about 7 in the morning, go home, make some coffee, take a shower, then lay down for some hours. I sleep on a metal bed that rattles whenever you move. This morning I was laying in bed half asleep when I thought I heard something knocking at the foot of my bed. I disregarded it at first as my dog was sleeping in my bed towards the foot. I thought maybe he kicked the footboard, or maybe one of the kids came in the room and hit it. I fell back asleep and was awoken by several distinct knocks from coming under my bed. Again, half asleep, I yelled, "Knock it off," thinking it was my son playing under the bed. I rolled over to look under the bed and nothing was there. Just me and the dog, who was sound asleep. I've been very depressed lately, and I wonder if something is trying to communicate something to me. I started hearing these noises, like the noises you know are happening, but you can't really explain what sounds they were. The best way to put it is that it was shuffling. But this isn't the first time that it's happened on Friday night. My dad has heard banging on our washer and dryer, and he assumed that someone had broken in, so we asked him if he locked the back door. And when he got back from work, he said, probably not. So he grabbed a firearm and I a bat, and we went with him, and found out the door was locked. So we were going back upstairs and he said, well, what if they locked it when we came down to make it seem like they weren't here? So we went into the basement and turned on every light, checked every corner until we got to the washer and dryer. Here's a little context about the washer and dryer room that we keep shut because it leaks when we do laundry. But the room is fairly big and only half of it gets wet, but the other half is nice looking with a tile floor. When we first moved in, we found that they'd left Beatle posters in there, so I put it in my room, but that soon changed when I had to put it back downstairs. When we finally moved in, I didn't actually sleep there. I actually spent the night at a family member's house and stayed for 2 days. But when I came home, I didn't actually sleep. I stayed up all night playing a game with some pals. It's also important to note that my door is busted, so when you push the door open, it gets stuck at the top, so you have to push it open with force. I believe it was around sunrise when I heard this noise, the sound of scratching. But the off part wasn't at the bottom. It was closer to the top of the door, so I kind of stared at the door while it was happening. And then the door would push forward a bit like someone wanted to come in, but eventually stopped outside. And it wasn't my cat, because he was sleeping in my parents' room with the door closed. And after that, our guests would say they had an uneasy feeling in the basement. And soon, people would start seeing things walking through doorways in the basement. So we did the sage thing and it stopped, but we would start hearing talking. So I finally put the poster downstairs again and it stopped for a few months. Side note, we later figured out that the owner's brother was shot and lost his life here during a party. And the person who did it to them ended their own life on our porch. And there's blood stains on the stairs and on the carpet and in the front room. And until we started moving around the basement to fit my drum set, and after we soon found an old book from the previous owner. From then till now, we kept hearing the drums be played while no one's downstairs. One day I had a friend over. We were hanging out in the room with the posters, and we have this cubby hole that once you go in, it's the width of the wall. So me and my pal went to the end and sat there in the dark and tried to ask questions, but nothing happened until we saw a face at the end, close to the entrance, so we got scared and left. My friend didn't like going down there after this last incident, so me and my buddy were messing around, and I think he was trash-talking the thing, so it would do something, and all I remember is my friend falling and hitting his head on a baseball bat on the floor, and he later said that I pushed him, and he had hit his head, and he couldn't see my face, it was so dark, and I was trying to pick him up, and he said he thinks something weird was going on, and he had this weird dream a few days ago of something attacking him, where it was all dark and it tried to pick him up. After that, my cabinets would open by themselves during the night, and so we just asked for it to stop and leave us alone, and it did. But then the drums started happening and my grandma passed away, and my mum and I would start waking up with bruises for about a week, and soon we started hearing conversations in the basement. It's like you could hear the sound of talking, but you couldn't make out anything they said. And then it started moving stuff when I got to school. I'd closed my door, and one day my mum was in the kitchen making food when she heard things being thrown and tossed around in my room, but she was too scared to find out what was happening. So when I came home, most of my pop vinyl figures were on the floor everywhere, and sometimes we would hear the broken dryer downstairs move slightly, and soon it moved to talking in our kitchen, and then it just stopped until last month. Lately, all it's been doing is making noise when we watch TV, but when we pause it or mute it to listen, to see what's happening, it will stop, and that's what confuses us the most. I've seen our doorbell ring. The most noticeable of all is this mist that already looks like a dog, but when you look outside, it's nothing. And that brings us to today. If maybe someone could help me explain it, I'd be gratefully appreciative. When I was in the Marines, I was deployed to Afghanistan in October 2011. I was on a forward operating base, Hansen, for the first few months, and forward operating base Jackson for the last few months, before getting moved to Camp Leatherneck for the last few months, when our replacement showed up. My job was to operate the laundry service as well as provide clean water for showers. Technically not clean enough to drink, but you could, for US and Afghani troops. After the first few months or so on Hansen, whenever I tried to sleep, I could feel a hand grabbing at my calf and slowly work its way up. I immediately dismissed it as being a result from stress or sleep paralysis type thing, and it would kind of subside since it wasn't a very strong feeling at all. This happened for a night or two a week, but eventually stopped. Fast forwarding to when I was on Leatherneck, nothing happened when I was at Jackson, or even my short trip to Nalé, so I forgot about it. At this point, a lot of real-life stuff had happened, and I was having issues going to sleep, so I would play music in some earbuds, or I would rewatch a movie in my head. Basically anything to get my mind off the day's events. I slept in a room with 2 to 4 other people, so depending on who was there, I would try to be considerate, especially with the not ideal layout of the 6 or so bunk beds. There was an emergency exit sign above the door that glowed a soft orangey red. One of the nights when I was running something in my head, with me being 100% awake, eyes closed and no headphones, I heard 2 people talking. This was not something I would imagine at all, but I was curious since I could hear them quite clearly. The conversation in my head went something like this. Hi. Hey. What are you guys up to? We're just looking around. Where are you from? We work for Nying. You work for Nying? No, silly. And then I feel a slap on my sleeping bag. I immediately prop myself up on my elbow and look down at my sleeping bag, and there's a handprint on the fabric. Old 3-part puffy sleeping system where I felt the slap, and it was at an angle that no one in the room could have gotten at. The other two were passed out with headphones on, and on the other side of the room there was no one else besides the three of us. At this point I noped out for a smoke, and then I returned and put some headphones on and went to sleep. 2 nights later, I had the worst dream to date. I hope it was a dream anyway. I woke up in my bed and noticed that the normal orange light was blue, and there was a faint electrical buzz, and there was a figure standing in the light. It was a solid black figure with no discernible facial features, but I could see an outline of it, and it looked like a British boy from around the 1900s based on the outfit. When I looked at it, I felt the worst sense of fear and dread ever. You could tell me that I had to go drive a car over a landmine, and I wouldn't feel like this. After a few seconds, I just drifted back to sleep, and nothing occurred for the rest of the night. Just for some context, my bedroom window is in the back of my house, and I can see the next door neighbor's back door. He is a dealer. All the windows in the back of his house and from his living room window can see directly to my bedroom window. Great. He's watched me grow up since we've lived next to him my whole life, and he also has a garbage bag covering the downstairs door window 99% of the time. This all started at the beginning of the month, as far as I know, when I noticed he left his downstairs light on, and there was a sign that said, "Can I see you?" with a big smiley face. I thought it was kinda weird and laughed it off. Then last night at 4 a.m, I woke up and opened my window to get some air, and I saw him downstairs with the light on again, and a sign that said, "Let me have you." Now this really freaked me out, because I'll be 18 in 4 months and I'm still a minor, whereas this guy's in his 50s or something. I took a picture and I showed my mum, who thought it was disgusting and creepy, and I just thought that was that. Now tonight, once again, I opened my window because my room is small, so it gets really hot. And he once again swapped the sign to say, "I'll be good," and I checked through all the other windows that we can see his house in, and he has it so that only I can see it from my room. To say the least, I had a full-on anxiety attack and got my mum. She doesn't know what to do since he's a dealer, and he obviously knows people that could make our lives hell if we call the cops. I'm really stuck in a weird place right now, and I don't know what to do. This happened last year at the university I currently attend. I met 3 friends, Sarah, Jill and Mike. Sarah and I met back in high school, who I ran into at college. We ended up rekindling our friendship. She told me a secret that she kept in high school, that she was a lesbian and was out, and introduced me to her girlfriend Jill and their friend Mike. When we all ate in the school's dining hall, the 4 of us kind of became pretty close and ended up meeting and hanging out as a group frequently. Even though there was a little drama between Mike and Sarah, because both have a thing for Jill and would occasionally get jealous or try to impress her. Mike brought up to me that him and Jill actually had a cuddle session in her dorm room, which Sarah didn't know about at the time. I have to admit, I also had a thing for Jill. She had a nice smile, pink hair, and a sweet, positive, Johnny personality that attracted a lot of people. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, myself, Mike, Sarah and Jill made it a habit to have a weekly hangout, late at night. I was the only one with a vehicle, so we would go riding around in my truck. We'd leave around 8 p.m. and would not be back until 3 a.m. We'd drive around town, just riding or walking to the downtown area, and occasionally to stop and grab snacks, or at a local store that was open, or even at a friend's house where Sarah and Jill could get high for the night. One night around 2 a.m. we passed a local park that's pretty popular, and Jill playfully yelled for us to go to the park. I was a little skeptical about the idea at first, but the majority overruled as everyone seemed excited about the idea. When we pulled up at the park, it was pretty spooky. It was dark and didn't seem like the great place to be at this time of night. Jill was the first person to jump out of the truck along with Sarah and me. Mike was not far behind. Me and Sarah headed over to the swings while Mike and Jill ran around and played on the playground equipment like 5-year-old kids. Near the park was a large sitting area, and in the distance I could see 2 dark figures, and I pointed them out to Sarah. We assumed they were homeless people because the park is normally infested with them. They kept watching us over the fence behind the woods, and I could hear someone walking through. This was getting creepy, and Sarah also felt the same way, and we yelled at Jill and Mike, who were having a great time on the slide, that we were leaving. We left, and apparently those 10 minutes were so good that the majority insisted we come back the next day. The next night comes around, and we do our usual routine. It's 2:30 a.m. and we're at the park again. This time, there are more homeless people coming out of the woods who look pretty creepy. Jill again was the first to jump out of the truck and say, "Are you coming, kids? We're gonna have a fun day again," in her excited voice. So we go to the play area, and apparently what we didn't notice is that we were trespassing as the park opening hours were over. But the gate was still open, so we proceeded anyway. Me and Sarah were again on the swings watching our backs and looking for any suspicious activity, while Mike and Jill were playing on the monkey bars. 10 minutes later, a grey car pulls up at the end of the fence and just sat there. Me and Sarah looked at each other, and we watched it for about half a minute. The lights in the car came on for a quick second, and we could see there were 3 men in there, but we couldn't get a good look. They sat there, then slowly drove around to the entrance of the gate. Jill and Mike both looked at me, and Sarah was worried. This seemed highly suspicious because no one would be at this park at this time of night unless they were homeless and looking for a place to sleep or do something else. As the car got closer, I demanded everyone to head to the truck. The 4 of us all ran, and the faster we ran, the faster the car drove to the entrance of the gate. We jumped into my truck and drove away, and we could see the car following us for a certain distance, and then we lost it. We were all pretty creeped out and shaken up, and we still avoid that park to this day. I told another friend about this incident, and he wasn't very surprised. He said that the neighborhood and area that surrounds the park are known to have a high crime rate, especially that late at night. I told this to Sarah, Jill, and Mike, and to this day we always ask the question, what would have happened if we'd have stayed or got caught? So to the individuals in the grey car, let's not meet again. 5 years ago, I was a dealer. Nothing big. I sold about 3K of the green stuff. Normally, my dealer would come to my apartment and give me 100 kilos, but he didn't have that much, so I had to drive to the next big city to get more. So me and 2 friends went to Stuttgart to meet a friend of mine. He lived in a social apartment which was paid from our country. It was a big house with at least 50 little apartments. It was like a guest toilet. There was a big bed and a TV right in front of it, nothing more. It was the smallest room to live in I'd ever seen in my life. On the bed, there's a topless guy, pierced and skinny as hell, completely on speed, bumping around the bed, watching a blue screen on the TV, and listening to hard trance. The room was a complete mess, medication and cigarettes everywhere. I was scared to sit on the bed and didn't want to sit on a needle or anything, but I did it anyway. We spoke a bit about how it's going and stuff, and he told us that he was robbed 2 days ago, and showed us the weed and mollies. Weed was in a tobacco box on the floor and the molly on top of it. 2 minutes later there was a knock on the door, when a little 16-year-old kid appeared and then vanished. All of a sudden the door rips open, and then 2 of the biggest guys I've ever seen came in, screaming at us and telling us to get on the floor. I wasn't sure what was happening. They were wearing weird combat clothes, as well as having weapons under their belts. "Why are you dealing on our boss's territory?" they said. Me and my friend sitting next to each other looked on the floor completely dazed and froze. I liked They searched the room for everything and took it all from him, slapped him in the face and screamed at him. At the same time, in my hands and in my jacket, I had 2,000 euros, hoping they wouldn't find it. Suddenly, one of them grabbed a Coca-Cola bottle and told them to turn around, but the other said they had no time and they left. Scared as hell, we looked at each other completely out of our minds and said nothing. They must have been high as well. Unfortunately for them, they didn't see what was actually in the middle of the room in the boxes, so our deal was good to go anyway. The only thing I was worried about were the two Goliaths waiting for us to come out. So the dealer guy called a friend who was living in the same house to protect us while we left, but nobody was out there when we drove home safely. My other friend waited outside and screamed at us for waiting that long. I almost hit him in the face when I told him the story, which he didn't believe at first, but we insisted it was true. I hope to never see those guys again, and I'd stopped doing this after that. It's so scary. My dad was a United States Navy helicopter pilot for 20 years. He was stationed on a number of aircraft carriers and had been all over the world. He had a lot of stories, but this one is my favorite. Many years ago, the ship my dad was stationed on was granted a night of shore leave in Tokyo. The next day, when the ship was supposed to leave, it was delayed because one of the sailors wasn't accounted for. Turns out he was in a Tokyo jail. The sailor had gotten blackout drunk and on his stumble back had spotted something in a very expensive BMW he decided he needed. He broke the window with his bare hands, bloodying it severely. At this point, he must have decided he needed to clean up, because he somehow opened a fire hydrant with no obvious tools. He was picked up by Tokyo police sitting on the curb with a bloody arm, next to a broken-in car and gushing water. Lucky for him, Japan had a cooperative agreement with the US Navy, where they let the Navy deal with these things internally, and he was quickly turned over to the ship and finally left. He was asked what it was that he was trying to get from the car, and also how he managed to open the hydrant. Unfortunately, he couldn't remember a thing about the entire incident. Go figure. I was working in a retail store in a pretty sketchy area. There was this lady who was obviously a heavy drug user, or at least ex-drug user. She must have been in her 50s to 60s. She was notorious on my blog for being crazy. But she'd come to me all the time and told me that she thought I was cute. It was really bizarre because she looked like a crackhead, but she'd act like a teenage girl around me. I tried to be nice to her because she was known for being volatile. Anyway, on Christmas Eve, she packed an entire Christmas dinner, which she told me was all home-cooked Guyanese food, and a cologne set. As she was leaving, she just squats down on the floor and throws her hands up and starts cackling. Yes, cackling, which faded to a giggle. Never saw her again. And for those of you wondering, yes, I did eat the food. It was delicious. When I was little, around 6, my bed used to shake at night. I didn't really scare easy, even then. I'm too annoyingly logical. The first few times it baffled me, but it continued every night, and it started to scare me. It definitely wasn't a dream, because it became the reason I couldn't fall asleep. I would shake, you know, when the washer is in the spin cycle, and it might gently vibrate, anything that close. It was like that, except not as consistent in rhythm and more subtle. It happened every night when I go to bed, at the same time, and the washer was not even running, nor anything else going on at that time that would cause it. At first I didn't say anything, but then I finally told my parents. At first they laughed, but they saw it was really terrifying me. So my mum and brother tried to lay with me once or twice to feel it. Of course it didn't happen when someone else was in the bed. They just passed it off as my imagination being too wild. So I had to basically just grin and bear it, and it stopped after about 6 months. Recently it started happening again on and off. The shaking will wake me up in the middle of the night. Though now I'm in my 30s, married, and live on the other side of the country where I used to live. I wake up with the bed moving and I'm just like, this can't be real, right? I turn over and try to go back to sleep. My rational brain trying to come up with all kind of explanations of what it could be. But it's scary as hell. I just don't know what to think about it. This is a story that happened to a girl I dated. She used to work at a home improvement store, and there was this middle-aged guy who used to come in regularly and hang around the store and talk to her. He seemed a little slow and clingy, but harmless. He would always address her by name and say that she was pretty. This one day he was in the store as they were closing, and he witnessed a male co-worker give her a hug before he left. The next day, that male co-worker finds his tires slashed in his driveway. No one made any connection to the nice middle-aged guy who came into my batteries 5 times a week. Meanwhile, this girl had been noticing that she was always losing underwear at home. She assumed that she had been losing them in the wash or simply misplaced them and thought nothing of it, and even joked about it with her mum. Then it happened. She was sleeping one night and woke up to find this guy standing silently over her bed, staring down at her with her panties pressed against his face. She flipped and ran out the sliding glass door on the back of the house, the same unlocked door that, as they found, was where he'd been going in. He'd been using that door to get in at night for months, to watch her sleep and play with her underwear.